Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Tickleman and I'm a Microsoft Technical Trainer. I'm here today to inform you on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today I'll be focusing on Copilot for Microsoft 365 data governance. The product and features that will be discussed are current as of the time of this recording. And because of the rapid rate of change in technologies, I encourage you to reference the product documentation to get the most current information on the features and functions that are available. Let's get into this. With all the deployments and the configurations of compliance and governance components that we've talked about, at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you are monitoring that your compliance goals are being maintained. And as environments change over time, you want to make sure that the drift is within acceptable measures. And so while it has never really been talked about in each one of the other modules, as you build your tolerance levels and what your actions are going to be to respond to those, you want to also have those tolerable levels of at what point do I have to not just take actions, but do I need to potentially adapt and change the monitoring tools that I'm working with. So this module is going to get into the monitoring of your regulatory compliance that you've now done for, in this case specifically, Copilot for Microsoft 365, and all of the things that we've mentioned across a variety of videos to make sure that you feel comfortable that the correct use of the data within Copilot for M365 is within the tolerance levels of your organization. So we're going to take a look at some of the tools that are available for you. Then we'll do a demonstration. I'll go in and show some of the compliance reports that are available, but we're just going to give you an overview of compliance. And this goes across all of our products that we feel that you should be actively monitoring. You'll see that this is a diagram that's been used in other courses that, other than in the center diagram, the only thing that changes. But you want to take a look at a standard practice of best use for monitoring your solutions. You want to be able to identify what it is that you need to monitor, because monitoring everything potentially may or may not be the requirement. Having too much information is almost as damaging sometimes by not having enough information. When you take a look at some of the monitoring that I've done in the past, I had one customer that had so much being monitored and they didn't have the threshold monitored calculated correctly, and the dashboard was always showing a potential issue. They were showing up as a red flag, and they would go in and investigate, and nothing was there because it was just based around some number of activities that caused this to show red in the console that they were dealing with. And what ended up happening was, when I got called in, we actually changed the threshold to be matching what they had deployed in the environment because they'd never adapted or changed. They said it once and just let it be that way. Well, meanwhile, as they rolled this out more and more to a broader range of the audience, just the volume of traffic that was coming through the monitoring solution was triggering the behaviors that indicated that you might want to come take a look at this. And while there was never really a problem, they just reset it and then got to the point where they were not even looking anymore because they would reset it and minutes later it would turn red again. And they just got used to it being red, but then they were ignoring an actual problem that got surfaced. So this is a behavior that you want to monitor. You want to go in and check things. And if things are showing up as a potential error, investigate them. And it may be something as simple as it's the expected behavior, which is something has adapted or changed in the environment that you need to be able to respond to. So this becomes an ongoing component of your monitoring feature. So you'll see that circle is an endless loop of identifying these things, deploying them, making sure that you're bringing in new preventative measures if there's things that were available before. Because one of the things you'll get in our products is that on a constant basis, they're being evolved and created. In an earlier video, I showed that there was a feature in the Know Your Data component, that there's a feature that was marked as preview at that time. By the time you watch that video, it might be actually in general availability, so you could actually add that to your monitoring solution as well as the deployment because you now had it available in the solution itself. So think about the compliance and what you want to do from a monitoring perspective on an ongoing basis. When you take a look at the tool itself, we have a variety of standard consoles and pages that you can bring up to actually get in and see the summaries of what you've deployed. Now you'll see that we've talked about compliance from a security perspective. This is data, and you want to make sure that you've protected it and make sure that as people have access to this information, maybe you want to make it available to users of specific departments as you're monitoring their use of Copilot for Microsoft 365, or maybe if they've not come compliant in the governance model, we talked about communication. And if they weren't following the communication protocols, if it got flagged, you might want to make that available to them. And so we've got a wide variety of roles that are built-in roles. You can also build custom roles depending on the needs to gain access to the data in its entirety. Can they read it? Can they change it? Or is it just a subset of the data that they're getting and taking a look at? So take a look at your monitoring solution and being able to make sure that you're not having just one person look at this. It's made available broadly to the people that would be interested and be potential responsible for the correction in the behavior of the people who might be causing those triggering actions in my example that I gave you around compliance for communications. So the dashboards that we have, as I said, there's a number of them that are in there by default. This is just volumes of information. While there's in Compliance Manager a dashboard that's built, you could feed this into some of the other monitoring solutions that are available from Microsoft through Azure Monitor. We get into workbooks and analytical work. You get into a whole set of Power BI capabilities that you're working with. But the dashboard that we'll be showing you in the example is for Compliance Manager and some of the default organizations. And it does provide a general across the org perspective of the whole thing, and there has drilled down capabilities that you can take a look at. So there's some scores that come up, and we'll show you how to calculate some of those numbers and potentially change them, but there's a scorecard value that will come up and indicate where things are within tolerable levels. Are they on the fringe of that? So you can get ahead of the potential breach or the potential problem that might be caused by going into a non-compliant state. But you do want to have these available. You can also trigger on alerting to happen so that if you're not monitored on a regular basis, you might want to say, I need to know as soon as this goes into a non-compliant state. I don't want to have to wait for me to maybe come back the next day. And you can automate a lot of those responses as well. So again, taking a look at some of the other compliance management features that we have available to you, the assessment progress of becoming compliant, so you can actually see a potential ramp up of bad behavior, and also in the remediations of how are the remediations taking place, how quickly do we need to accelerate those and put more resources into making them compliant? But we have a whole set of controls, not just for the monitoring of it, but being able to actually see those behaviors changing over a period of time. When you take a look at the dashboards themselves, we've got a set of scores that you're working with. And I said I'll be doing this in the demonstration. So you'll really see this in action with the score, what the action was, and if there's any vulnerabilities and or remediations that it can have, they actually have all of those available to you through the compliance dashboards that you have available. So we're going to get in, and I want to show you a number of these features. So I'll bring up a compliance dashboard. I'm going to have some examples that I've built for compliance requirements in other modules that I've delivered or other recordings that we've had. And I'm going to use those deployments. So if you're interested in what it is that I'm going to be monitoring, maybe find the video that deals with whether it's identity management, was it data governance that you're dealing with. If you're interested in those specific configurations, you could go off and look for that video and you'll see the configurations that were set that we're reporting back into the compliance features. So let's go off to that demonstration and take a look at compliance dashboards.
We've described governance as the ability to predict the outcomes of a person-to-person, person-to-system, system-to-system, or system-to-person interaction. Having the compliance requirements where you can define what that is and then measure if it is in compliance is an important part of the reporting, because setting the governance policies is one thing, but making sure that they are being enforced is the proof. If we wanted to check governance, we have a number of tools available for us to watch this. So off of the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, selecting compliance. Once you're in the compliance portal, we have the compliance manager that is going to allow us to then take a deep dive at the assessment of the policies that have been deployed. The opening screen provides an overview of a score and almost gamifies some of the capabilities that the portal will provide. You'll see that we have points that are assigned to different compliance features, and you can gain those points by bringing them into compliance. You can see that I've got 5 items of 484 that are in compliance. compliance, and I could drill through into each one of them to identify what is out of compliance and what is the recommended remediation. You'll see that a lot of different ways to get to each one of these. I could click on it here, I could click on it over here and find the specific item. I can come into the improvement actions that identifies each individual compliance attribute and drill down into its specific recommendations. For example, by clicking on the Enable Explorer Data Execution Prevention, or DEP, I can now see what are the details, links to articles. I can look at the evidence that if I wanted to upload of what the compliance issue is, maybe there is a requirement that it needs to be bypassed and I have an email that I can add. But you can see I can add a wide variety of different documents and links to support decisions and actions that were taken on the subject. Some of the related controls that we can dive into to get some more information about each one of these, again, is very easily accessible by clicking on the item itself. It will then give us some information about that related control. Going back to the home page, I can then take a look at solutions. You'll see that they are broken up into solution areas. For example, in e-discovery, you can see that I have 5 specific remediations that I can work with on this topic. That brings me back into the improvement actions, and it filters them down to those specific activities. Clicking on the assessments, what you can do is group these together and deploy them to a set of resources. And so now in data protection baseline for Microsoft, I can look at the details regarding the data protection baseline for Microsoft 365. I can see 51% assessment progress. I can take a look at the controls that were identified, and then the specific improvement actions that I can take based on a hierarchical rating. So just a high-level overview of the Compliance Manager dashboard and some of the reports that it makes available. And remember that these can be assigned to individuals for just portions or the entire compliance dashboard so that they can work on individual topics or areas of expertise or areas of concern that they might be directly involved with. Let's return to the lesson.
Welcome back. So we've taken a look that compliance had a whole life cycle that started from you had to ideate and figure out what needed to be in your compliance. We took a look at the pillars of compliance. We looked at zero trust, and we saw that there was the 2 major areas of identity management and data management or governance that we had. And within those, they had multiple pillars that made up those major areas. All of them are available for us for a monitoring capability. And so it is a strong recommendation that you do monitor this, especially as you start to now incorporate Copilot for M365. This is maybe something new for you. And you want to make sure that you get this right, because the potential impact, I was just talking with someone recently about this. In the past, AI is not going to cause a breach. It is only going to expose a breach that might already be there. So an example, I've talked over and over again throughout these lessons, that you can protect your data, and if it's protected, Copilot for M365 follows and honors those restrictions. And so if people shouldn't have access to something, they don't have access to something. But what you might be afraid of is, well, I don't know what people can't gain access to, but you might have petabytes of data that no one knows they have access to because they're just not going looking for it. But now if someone were able to put a prompt into a Copilot for AI to ask for a solution, and it had access because you didn't know that that person had access, it could surface that vulnerability in the results of the prompt request. And so now you've got a breach that existed before. Copilot did not create the breach. It just exploited the one that was there. So this is going to be a great way, hopefully not to do a test through fire. You want to make sure that you're checking this stuff beforehand. And so you want to make sure that you're monitoring on an ongoing basis, especially in the early days of rolling this out, to make sure that there is no gaps in your vulnerability protection that you have that are there currently that will be exposed very quickly through the use of something like Copilot. You're better off, and you're going to do something, even if you don't roll Copilot out to your users, you are doing the organization a favor by protecting that data, because it is a vulnerability and it will get exploited eventually. But this is going to now also cover that vulnerability and provide the powerful tools that Copilot for Microsoft 365 provides for the organization. So I think there's more upside by implementing Copilot and having these vulnerabilities protected than not having the vulnerabilities protected but not having Copilot. So that's, for me, that discussion. So strongly recommend implement Copilot for M365, get the benefits from it, and make sure that your data is in a secure environment. So thanks very much for spending some time with me. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Tickleman and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. I'm here today to inform you on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today I'll be focusing on Copilot for Microsoft 365 data governance. The product and features that will be discussed are current as of the time of this recording, and because of the rapid rate of change in technologies, I encourage you to reference the product documentation to get the most current information on the features and functions that are available. Let's get into this. Do you wonder how large language models, also referred to as LLMs, are going to impact your organization when you connect them to your organization's data? I want to present Copilot for Microsoft 365, which will transform how you work by leveraging large language models that interact with your organization's data. Before I get into what Copilot for Microsoft 365 can do for you, I want to explain why you should be comfortable using Copilot for Microsoft 365 with your data. If you're wondering how LLMs know what they know, let me break down the mechanics of what makes this possible. And then I will detail how Copilot for Microsoft 365 respects your privacy and keeps your data safe. First, let's look at where LLMs get their knowledge. They are trained on massive amounts of public data, including books, articles, and websites, to learn language, context, and meaning. You can interact with LLMs using natural language and a prompt. Before we get into the prompt itself, we want to make sure that you understand that the LLMs excel at creating information, whether it be text or documents, and we'll get into examples of this. They're built using machine learning principles, particularly around natural language and neural networks in that architecture. They are a specific model of AI, and they understand and generate, as I said, natural language. So a prompt is typically a statement or a question. The clarity and details of either will greatly influence the response you get back. When you ask a question in a prompt, the LLM generates a response based on its public data training, an understanding of context, which you can get in part from how you phrase your prompt. For example, you might give it more details to generate a response. As you continue to ask questions and get responses, the large language model is temporarily getting more context. Your full conversation gets sent with each subsequent prompt, so the LLM can generate relevant responses as you chat with it. It's processing natural language and referring to its knowledge like you would in a conversation. A key difference, though, is that it only remembers the conversation while it's in that conversation. The chat history is wiped clean with each new conversation, and it won't use the knowledge from your conversation and interactions to train the model. That said, you can write your prompt to include additional information, which the LLM will refer to as it generates its response. This is how you can give the LLM a little more knowledge it might need to answer your question. Before I get into an example of generating a response, I want to define a couple of terms that will be talked about. Specifically, a term referred to as semantic indexing. There are several components that go along with this, and you'll see how it does what it does. Let's take a look at semantic indexing. Semantic indexing is made up of a semantic search, which is a vector mapping of words that mean the same thing. Tech, technology, technologies, dog, cat are all pets. So you're seeing some similarities. Then you get a semantic relationship, and you're seeing just a small example of what some of those will be. A dog is a mammal, part of something. So works for, located in, causes. So you're seeing some examples of the semantic relationship that we have. The benefits that you're going to get from the semantic relationship is the deeper contextual understanding of the natural language. So you don't have to know the language that it needs you to understand. You can speak in a more natural format because of the massive amounts of ways that people have referred to something. It has that mapping of what that context might be. And it has the ability to take what might be a vague comment or abstract input and be able to make some sense with it. So my pro tip to you would be that in your prompts, I ask it to, if you have any questions, ask me for clarity. Otherwise, it potentially could take a vague comment and, based around its mapping of semantic components, be able to make an assumption. So you don't want it to do that. And it provides for a crisper, cleaner response from the LLM. So let's go back and show you how this works using Microsoft Bing Chat GPT, which is a public service that has no affiliation with your organization's data. First, I'll ask Copilot for Microsoft 365 a completely random question that it can't answer. What color shirt am I wearing today? It knows what a shirt is, but it can't see me to be able to answer the question, so it responds accordingly, which is an accurate response. Let me ask the question again, this time including some additional data. So before we get back into the example, I wanted to give you a couple of key takeaways. You know what a topic is now. It is that conversation, and for that period of time, the LLM is going to retain the information that you've asked it, as well as its feedback or responses that it's given to you. And each new response is going to be based around a complete prompt of all the information that it had before. And it's only going to be done within that topic. As you start a new topic, conversation, all of that information is wiped clean and you start fresh. You can provide additional information and files in your prompt if you want to, and it can provide language and tone that you might be looking for. And you can also provide more focus the more you provide topic information throughout that ongoing response, new prompt environment. Let's get back into the example. Now you can see it responds using the information I gave it, which is more in line with what I was looking for. And now that it has the context, I keep asking it relevant questions like, what color shoes do I have? Again, I want to stress that your interactions with the LLM do not exist beyond the topic. And more importantly, they will not be used to train the LLM, and any of the information that you give it as additional information will not be used to train the LLM going forward, especially in that public environment. And it knows this because the prompt builds with each interaction. And to prove that the large language model doesn't retain the information, I'll start a new chat session and ask my question again. What color shirt am I wearing today? And now it again responds, indicating that it cannot answer the question because it can't see me. It knew what shirt I was wearing before only because I temporarily provided the additional limited information. In this new session, it no longer has access to what I said before, and I never told it my shirt color, so it doesn't know. So how does this work then in context to Copilot for Microsoft 365? In my previous example using Bing Chat, I provided the prompt more information and context to give the LLM what it needed to generate the right response. This is what Copilot for Microsoft 365 systems will do automatically for you as you interact across different apps and experiences. To do this, Copilot has several core components. First off are the large language models hosted on Microsoft Cloud via Azure OpenAI services. To be clear, Copilot is not calling the public OpenAPI services that power ChatGPT. Copilot for Microsoft 365 uses its own private instances of the LLM. Next, Copilot for Microsoft 365 has a powerful orchestration engine that I'll explain in a few minutes. Copilot capabilities are surfaced in and work with all of the Microsoft 365 apps. It is trained on public data, but it will not retain your private data inside of its training. As well, you will only have secure access to the information that you have access to natively in your environment, as well as it only exists within the topic sessions that you're talking with. Microsoft Search is used for information retrieval to feed prompts, like I did in the example before, where information I provided in my prompt was used to help generate the answer. Then there's Microsoft Graph, which has long been a foundational component of Microsoft 365, which includes additional information about the relationships and activities over your organization's data. The Copilot system respects user access permissions to any content and graph information it retrieves. This is important because Copilot for Microsoft 365 will only generate responses based on information that you have explicit permissions to access. In case you're not familiar with Microsoft Graph, it is a set of APIs that allows you to connect across the entire Microsoft ecosystem and extract data regarding specific user information, whether it be in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, SharePoint, as well as a wide variety of other built-in connectors you're seeing across the entire M365 environment, features inside of Azure, as well as third-party components for Salesforce, Jira, and ServiceNow, just to name a few. We'll also be showing you in another lesson the ability to go in and build your own connectors. Let's get back into the content. The key takeaways are that prompt responses will only include information that the user making the prompt has explicit access to be able to view. You can use traditional search capabilities of information that don't have the additional indexing capabilities of Copilot for M365 added to them. As well as the Microsoft Graph provides a full set of APIs across the entire Microsoft ecosystem, as well as other data sources that you can connect to and that they will still have to need explicit access to be able to read. Let's get back into the content. So Copilot for Microsoft 365 has its own default prompt with built-in rules for responsible interactions. This includes things like where to search to find the right information. For example, calling the Microsoft Graph to access your recent documents or messages to gain more context. It can also use this data to determine the style and tone of the response, like being informative for style and positive for tone. And of course, Copilot for Microsoft 365 will always respect responsible AI practices, such as ensuring that harmful content is not included in generated responses. The Copilot for Microsoft 365 Orchestrator combines the default prompt with your prompt and the additional information it's gathered and will form a long prompt to present to the LLM in order to generate a response. Remember that all prompts append the default prompt that you have no control over currently of responsible AI and making sure that ethical practices are going to be enforced. Copilot for Microsoft 365 works alongside you. For example, in Word, Copilot can easily write an entirely new document, like a business proposal using content from an existing file. Or in Outlook, based on the content you selected, Copilot can compose your email replies for you. In PowerPoint, you can transform your written content into a visually beautiful presentation with the click of a button. In Teams, Copilot can generate meeting summaries with discussed follow-up actions. Or while using Business Chat in Microsoft Teams, it can help you catch up on something that you may have missed, bring together information from multiple sources to bring you up to speed. Let's go back to the Copilot and Word example I just did and explain how that worked. Copilot for Microsoft 365 can help generate a draft proposal by using content you've been working on. For example, in OneNote or other documents that you may have access to, like Word and PowerPoint files. Here we combine the large language model training on how a proposal document is structured and written and mix it with the Copilot for Microsoft 365 orchestration, which scans and takes relevant inputs from the additional documents that you've selected to create your prompt. This prompt will then be appended with the Copilot default prompt information. The LLM is then able to generate an entirely new proposal document with the additional information from those files, providing a first draft that you can then use to save time and quickly get started. So the key takeaways are secure, trusted, and extensible. By secure, I mean that users are only going to be able to have access to the information that you have already granted them access to, and you're not going to leak out corporate data through the LLM. It can be trusted to maintain data governance requirements from data sovereignty and data classifications. And it can be extensible by using things like Microsoft Search, Microsoft Graph, as well as your own connectors to be able to access any data in your entire data state, whether it be in Azure, on-premises, or other clouds. So just like the business chat example, The important thing to remember here is that enterprise data used to generate information responses is only present temporarily as part of the prompt in the LLM. These prompts are not retained for LLMs for them to be trained or for future searches. All retrieved information is based on the individual data access and permissions that they will have using Copilot. I hope that you now have a better understanding of how the capabilities of Copilot for Microsoft 365 work. Make sure to check out the other overview sessions on Copilot 365 that we have, as well as full sessions detailing how you can deploy, configure, and secure Copilot for Microsoft 365, as well as restricting access and classifying data types in your organization so that individuals can only have access to the specific information they'll need while accessing Copilot for Microsoft 365. I hope to see you again in a future recording. Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Tickleman and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. I'm here today to inform you on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today I'll be focusing on Copilot for Microsoft 365 data governance. The product and features that will be discussed are current as of the time of this recording, and because of the rapid rate of change in technologies, I encourage you to reference the product documentation to get the most current information on the features and functions that are available. Let's get into this. Before I get started, I want to give you a definition of what grounding is, and to set the stage for everything else that's going to be covered today. Grounding is a generative AI term that means to give the system access to verifiable sources of information. I partly put this slide in because I love saying it reduces hallucinations. It's a technical term of the ability for AI and its training to be able to discern between things that are really relevant and things that may be incorrect, not factual, that then distort the response that it will give to you. So giving access or grounding your data to the LLM's ability to make recommendations is a good component of this. Taking a look at the overall picture that we're going to be taking a look at, I want to make sure that I'm clear with some of the definitions and terms that I'll be using and understand where they fit in this diagram that you see. In a traditional prompt response world of an LLM, what you have is a prompt that goes against the large language model that has been trained on that large volume of public data. What we have with the ability of Copilot for Microsoft 365 is we have a separate private instance of the large language model that is not publicly available. It's used by Copilot for Microsoft 365 to then combine with your data to be able to provide that grounding of the data itself. And so some of the terms you're going to hear is there is a search capability that is always there. There's Microsoft Graph, and we're going to talk about plugins that you can use. So take a look at this picture and see what Copilot is going to now do is tie us together to a specific instance of the large language model. It's not the OpenAI versions of public that are available in public Azure. And now what we have is the semantic search capabilities of your Microsoft 365 data, the files that are in Outlook, SharePoint, OneDrive, all of that whole data estate that you're working with. By grounding your data and the large language model of the public training that we now have a private Copilot that is specifically geared towards this closed ecosystem. And as we have with all the other components, the model information that is there was publicly trained and has now got access to your data. But anything that you do within the prompts and the responses, any data that you give to it, are not used to train that data. So starting off on that left-hand side of the graphic, you're going to take a look at Microsoft Graph. That is a long-standing set of APIs that allows you, not just in this AI world, but in traditional application development that you have, the ability to now tie pieces of things together. I'll give you an example. If I wanted to be able to build an email communication system to respond to an alert in Azure, one of the things that I've done in the past is I've been able to query people's status based around maybe their Teams meeting. So if they're in a Teams meeting and are going to be booked up for the next 3 hours, I could look at their email calendar if they've got good calendar hygiene. I could see, is someone even available, or are they away on vacation? So no sense sending them an email response or notification that something needs to be dealt with, because they're not going to be there. So Microsoft Graph is just one of those ways that I was able to query all of this data across an entire data state, and not just the files and folders that you might have that you might be thinking about. Going over to that center portion, you'll see that we now have plugins, and I'll do some demonstrations of this in a few minutes, where a plugin, and I want to pay particular attention here, you notice that the arrows are pointing in 2 directions. So not only am I pulling data into the LLM to be able to provide a response for me, through plugins, we have the ability to actually interact with that data. So I can query based on it, get responses, and then push back potential data to now reside in that environment. It doesn't exist within the LLM itself. So with that as the grounding, let's go ahead and take a look at what you can do with Microsoft Graph, connectors, and plugins to extend your data estate to be part of your Copilot for Microsoft 365 experience. A lot of the information that you work with today might be outside of your Microsoft 365 locations, OneDrive, SharePoint, all the pieces I've mentioned so far. So how can you safely bring that information into your Copilot for Microsoft 365 experience and ground generative AI results? To do this, there's 2 primary options that we have. First, you can use Microsoft Graph connectors to integrate the data sources that you want with semantic indexing for Copilot. This option pre-indexes read-only information that you define and then used by your prompts to drive the most relevant AI-generated responses. I did this back in that example where I showed you that one-way pathway of ingesting some information from an indexing perspective. It's not there to train the data. The second option uses managed and trusted plugins, including OpenAI plugins, Microsoft Teams messages extensions, and Power Platform connectors. With plugins, instead of pre-indexing information, they provide communication in real-time data retrieval, and optionally even the ability to write that data back. Both options follow Microsoft's comprehensive security, compliance, and privacy approach. That means that if you have existing or you want to enforce data privacy and sovereignty requirements, that you can have only the defined components exposed in your organization to the model. Let's show you an example of using a connector and a plugin simultaneously. Let's say I'm a help desk technician. I'm using Microsoft Teams and I want to send a message to the users experiencing an issue with DNS, and to write an email for me that I can send to them with instructions that reference the internal knowledge base articles. Copilot generates a response by pulling in information from both a plugin configured for Jira, which is used for my issue tracking, as well as a graph connector for an intranet site, which is where we have our help desk for our knowledge base. And it responds with a DNS-related ticket along with the steps for flushing DNS and an email it authored that I can now use to send to our users with the matching open ticket. You'll also see at the bottom of the response the ticket from the Jira plugin and the KB article from the Graph connector. If I scroll up and click on the Jira ticket details, you'll see that the plugin also presents an adaptive card to show me information and even allows me to take action. I'll hit Edit Issue, and right from within Teams, I can change the record in Jira. In the upper right corner of the status is already set to Done, but let's say that it was not done, but I have completed all the steps that needed to complete the task. I can update the ticket status from To Do to Done. And by hitting Save, I'll record that change in the Jira system. Next, I'll show you what is going on behind the scenes and how each one works. In the first option, we referenced an internal article, Leverage Semantic Indexing for Copilot, which works with Copilot for Microsoft 365 by default over internal Microsoft 365 data. When you submit a prompt, Copilot brings in the Microsoft Graph with a semantic index to correlate active signals, retrieving indexed information relevant to you. It presents the combination of your prompt with what was retrieved to the large language model to generate an informed response. Importantly, semantic indexes work on two levels. By default, it indexes information with SharePoint inside your organization's tenant. A second is each user also has their own separate index for email and their individual important documents, like files shared with them, where they were mentioned or commented in a document, and more. This two-pronged approach is what increases relevancy, allowing Copilot for Microsoft 365 to generate results that are unique to you as the user. Remember, this is done based on your approved access to the information. And a great way to demonstrate semantic indexing for real is by showing two sets of search results in SharePoint. One without using a semantic index and one with. Here we're searching on Melbourne ship room. Notice the typo. The one on the left is without semantic indexing. You can see results that retrieved based on keywords, a ranking, as well as last modified date for relevance. It presents a file summary for context, but it's not the specific information we're looking for. On the right, with the semantic index, you have a list of links, and notice that the informative answer right at the top. You can see that the index was mapped semantically through signals such as people relationships and recent activities surrounding the content. You can see how semantic indexes combined with Copilot for Microsoft 365 improves the search experience across Microsoft 365. So how do you take advantage of semantic indexing for your external data, like we just saw in this example? If you're already using graph connectors in Microsoft 365, they will work without any change. If not, before you connect to external data from Microsoft 365 Admin Center, you do need to enable the service or start a trial. And from there, you can then add a connection. There are options for enterprise websites and a few other common data sources listed here as well. For example, if you open up ServiceNow, you'll see that there are three options, one for ticketing, one for knowledge base, and one for catalog. In my case, I'll set up an enterprise website, and this will show you a few simple options to define the site, who can search the data source, and whether connector results are shown in the search. Then for even more options, you can go into advanced settings for more granular configurations with options to define meta tags, specific exclusions, semantic property labels, and customizations to the schema. Once you have a connection up and running, you'll be able to see integrated results using SharePoint Search with the connected site. In this case, I'll just perform a simple keyword search for troubleshooting instructions, and results are found in SharePoint locations as well as from connected sites. And here's the DNS article that was used as part of the retrieval process to response that I put up earlier. Let's look at our second option for data retrieval with Copilot using plugins. Let's start with how they work. With the plugin configured, when we submit the prompt, Copilot for Microsoft 365 leveraged that plugin to retrieve information directly from its source in real time without pre-indexing the data. It was also able to perform additional actions on behalf of the user, as long as they had the necessary permissions, like changing the status of the ticket. This time, I'll demonstrate the plugin by itself without a connection to the knowledge base. In Microsoft Teams, I'll write a new prompt to look for VPN-related tickets in our Jira system and submit it. Then Copilot uses that information to respond and finds 2 tickets in the system related to VPN issues. As I mentioned, plugins work without pre-indexing, and there are 3 types. They can be OpenAI plugins, Microsoft Teams message extensions, and Power Platform connectors. All 3 of these types of plugins are similar with similar packaging and components. Let's see how plugins work with a short tour of their code. This is an example of a Teams app manifest file that we can get from NuGet Package Manager to find the app packages and their details. You can see that it refers to a YAML file, and in that file, is where the API is defined for connecting to the external data or service, as well as any actions it takes on behalf of the user. Also note the natural language descriptions of the API GET operation and its response. These are used by the LLM to assess what the plugin can do to help respond to a prompt. And because these are portable components and can be used in OpenAI, Teams, or Power Platform, as a developer, you'll be able to maintain a single shared code base. Each will leverage the same underlying OpenAPI spec. Then to make plugins available to your Microsoft 365 environment, you'll need the Microsoft 365 Admin Center in the Integrated Apps page. Here you can choose from existing plugins from the store, or just like you would get any other application today. You can also upload your own plugins packaged directly in the Teams Admin Center. Either way, you can add the plugin. You're in control of who can access the plugin and its underlying data. These are the two main options available to you for safely bringing in data external to Microsoft 365 into your Copilot for Microsoft 365 experiences to ground generative AI results. To learn more, check out the aka.ms Copilot Extensibility. So hopefully this explains how to extend the data used by Copilot for Microsoft 365 at your organization. Make sure to check out the other overview sessions on Copilot for Microsoft 365, as well as the full sessions detailing how you can deploy, configure, and secure Copilot for Microsoft 365, as well as any restricted access or to classify the type of an organizational data that you want an individual to have access to. Thanks very much. I look forward to seeing you in a future recording. Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Tickleman and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. I'm here today to inform you on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today I'll be focusing on Copilot for Microsoft 365 data governance. The product and features that will be discussed are current as of the time of this recording. And because of the rapid rate of change in technologies, I encourage you to reference the product documentation to get the most current information on the features and functions that are available. Let's get into this. So as we explore Zero Trust and governance, we've taken a look in other recordings of what is Zero Trust. We've looked at identity governance, and now we're going to take a look at data governance. And specifically, what is data governance in relationship to the overall Zero Trust model. And we'll look at some very specific components of data governance. It's, again, a topic that is broad in spectrum, and there's people that make their entire careers just looking at this. So doing a few-minute video on it is probably an injustice. But from a perspective as either an Office admin or an M365 administrator, or maybe the person responsible for doing this, we want to look specifically at what is the impact to Copilot for M365 and the things that you could implement specifically to provide the controls that you have, governance, to make sure that those interactions yield the necessary or the appropriate outcomes and you're not oversharing data. We'll take a look at this term called information protection, and it breaks up into three very specific areas that we'll get in and show you how information protection will allow you to get to know what your data is, what you can do to protect the data, and what you can do in the case of what happens if it's not what I expected, and having that backup to say, if something negative were to happen to the data, how can I make sure that I don't lose that data other than just having backups available to me? So when you take a look at data governance, as you would expect if you've watched any of the other videos in this series, you've probably seen that this is a well-documented, well-researched environment with many recommendations coming from Microsoft on how to implement this in a very secure and safe manner. And so data governance is going to allow you to create that space for you to manage this, whether it be anywhere in your data estate, whether it be on premises, whether it be in Azure, or any of the other cloud providers that you might have. Now, I want to focus in just a few minutes on there's 4 boxes across almost the dead center there. We're going to take a look at the data catalog that you have available to you. And we'll show you how to know your data. You got to find out what the data is out there and whether you manually or automatically go off and inventory all that information. It gives you a perspective. And it's often amazing when I sit down with customers and we look at their data inventory that there's stuff out there. They're going, I had no clue, at the breadth. And there's stuff out there that, boy, they hadn't even heard about before. They had no clue that it existed, or it hadn't been around for years. They didn't know it still existed because, no one had deleted it. All these different things. It's amazing just to go through that exercise. You'll notice that the data sharing is a feature that is in light gray. At that point, it's in preview. So whatever you're watching this video, hopefully it has come out of preview and is in general availability. But that's going to be some of the governance features we have around the sharing of that information. But that doesn't stop us to finish the data governance piece. So moving further over to the right, you're going to take a look at the data itself. And so we'll take a look at the data estate itself, and then what you can do to provide policies in place to identify sensitive information and then control access to the information itself. When you take a look at protection, it is an ongoing process. I can't tell you, as long as I've been doing this, that anybody the first time out of sitting down in a room with some Post-it notes going, here's my data, here's what I want to do with it, we're done. This is an environment that, as creative as you can be, the first thing I often deal with when I deal with customers is say, what are the lessons that you've learned from the past? And why did you learn them? Because the best predictor of future behaviors are your past behaviors. And so if I can know more about what your past behaviors have done, because I know where you are now, hopefully, I can then better predict of where it is that we're going to go in the future. And really that's the goal of these protections that we want to put in place, is not protecting you where you are today, because hopefully you've done a good job of that. It's how do I protect against this unknown environment that I've yet to go to? You don't want to find out on a newscast that your organization has been breached, find a fix for it, and then, boy, I'm good going forward. This is a process. You've got to sit down, you've got to plan, you have to understand what the process is going to be, what you're going to protect. And then once you deploy this, you don't cross your arms and figure you're done. You've got to constantly go back and evaluate, because your environment hopefully is growing and adapting over time. And every time there's a change, by either adding or removing something or expanding potentially the sphere of influence, there is a potential attack surface that has been exposed. And you want to make sure that those new attack surfaces are not unprotected through the standard governance that you've already put in place. So think of this as an ongoing philosophy that, a line you might have heard me use in other recordings, is trust but verify. You trust that you've got the right measures in place, but you're going to have to verify them, constantly check them, and then check for new threats that are coming out that might be a threat for you. And especially now that we're going to introduce Copilot for Microsoft 365 as a great way to mine this rich volume of data that you have, make your businesses more productive, it's a new way to access that data. And you could potentially significantly overshare that information if you have not got the right protections in place. So this is a great opportunity, if you don't do it regularly, to implement this new evaluation from a very, very specific perspective of Copilot for M365 and what the impact is going to be. When you take a look at the deployment of an information protection, they have these three areas of, you got to know your data, you want to protect your data, and you want to prevent the data loss that you have. So those are going to be the three major areas we'll take a look at here to be able to put that implementation plan in place to say, what data do I have out there, the inventory components that you're dealing with, see the vastness of your estate regardless of where it is, seeing the classification of the data that you're dealing with so you can identify it en masse, because you want to automate this as much as possible. What can I do to actually protect that data from a security perspective, multi-factor authentication, whether it's governances, components for device management that you're dealing with. There's a wide range in other videos that we've talked about to protect the data. And then how do I prevent the data loss? And we'll take a look at data loss prevention capabilities that you can have that says, in the case of my knowing the data and protecting it, if it still doesn't protect me enough, how do I make sure that I don't lose access to the information? So specifically on the know your data, this is the ability to very quickly gather the information from the broad range of areas that you might have this data. And there's some that you might not even there might be some that you've even forgotten about. Often one that I ask customers about, and they said, I got my data inventory. I said, how about your offsite data or your disaster recovery site? And they went, oh, I never thought about that. So you really want to be able to think about the scope of where your data may reside. And you take a look now, as more and more people have maybe worked from home for a period of time, have you extended your data gathering capabilities to consider what might happen, maybe nothing, but what might happen if now all these users are VPN connected, through a secure connection to devices that they have at home? What is the likelihood that some of that data may reside on their local devices? Have you put your data gathering in there and put your protection surfaces out that far? So just giving you some insight to knowing your data and where it comes from. But it becomes one of the biggest challenges for many of the organizations to make sure that they've inventoried everything. Because if you don't know how to protect it. And so I'd rather over-inventory and realize that it's not a concern for me, or have something that was never intended to be backed up or protected because you didn't think it was an issue, to then all of a sudden become the issue itself. Because rarely do bad actors that are intentional, so it's not just some kind of drive-by, accidental breach of your data, that does happen, but usually the malicious behaviors happen very intentionally, and rarely do they come knocking at your front door looking for the easiest way in. They're going to go find some back door, they're going to find some area that they know has been unprotected, and they're going to attack that surface first. So you want to make sure that you're not excluding any areas in this data gathering component that you're dealing with. We then move on to the second of those pillars of taking a look at the way to protect the data. And there's a broad range of tools that are available to you, both from Microsoft and third parties, that you can do to implement practices. And so these things that you put in place to protect the data, whether it be access control permissions that you're dealing with, whether it's elevated controls that just in time, just enough, there's a whole series of components that you could bring together to provide the protection of the data. Now, the first thing is, don't give people access to something. Making sure if you have to give access, make sure that you've given them just enough access. So all of these individual layered approaches. Now, starting off with the zero trust model specifically, remember that people by default shouldn't have permissions to do anything. And what you want to do is open it up, and you want to do it on a gradual level. And if the built-in permissions are not there for you, you want to make sure that you built custom permissions to grant just that enough access that you're going to need in here. Don't take that old permission role of opening everything up and then trying to lock something down to restrict people. It's usually the wrong way to do stuff. DLP, or the data loss protection, falls into a wide variety of categories here. Once again, like everything else, this is a broad range topic that we are taking a very specific look at with regards to administration in Microsoft 365 as a product, and the ways that you can now consider protecting your data or preventing access or loss of it through the use of something like Copilot for Microsoft 365. So this is a broad topic. You want some more information, go take a look at the other recordings, but this is just going to give you hopefully an overview of the topic in the use of Copilot for M365's access to your data. So we've learned about the data. You'll see that. So you've learned about the data. You've got a plan that you've put in place for what is the data loss protection. Examples that I've used in previous recordings. Data loss protection falls in a wide variety of areas here. And so there's endpoint data loss protection. And the example I always use is, using information on the phone. I'm able to access that information. Can I take a screen capture of it? You can actually lock it down to prevent you from using the built-in phone capture capabilities to take a screenshot of that information. Short of taking another phone and taking a picture of it or bringing it over to a photocopier to photocopy the screen, I can control every use of that information. Yes, you have the permissions to access it, but how you access this is going to be a great way to be able to stop that oversharing. Now, there's other methods that we have within the data loss roles, and you'll see this in the demonstration in a few minutes, that get into legal retention hold and data loss prevention policies to make sure that people can't accidentally delete something. You're going to retain it for a period of time. So we got a broad range. Again, I'm just going to cover it from a perspective of Copilot for M365. So let's go take a look at preventing data loss.
In this lesson, we talked about the 4 principles of know your data, protect your data, prevent data loss, and govern your data. And while I'm not going to go into specifics on each one of those areas, I do want to give you an overview of where you would do this and where would that journey start. We do have separate recordings that will get into each of those concepts and each of these products very specifically if you want to follow up with those. So I've logged into the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and I've expanded the options down the left-hand side to show a whole series of the other options that are going to be available in the Admin Center, specifically around security, compliance, endpoint manager, and identity. These areas, if you select them, will get into very specific topics. For example, under security, you'll get a whole series of configurations for the protecting using a product called Microsoft Defender. There's a whole series of attack surfaces that you can protect using Defender. Down the left-hand side, we can get in and look at devices and identities, configuring some of the profiles that you want to send out. The second of the option of compliance is where you'll use a product called Microsoft Purview that is going to allow you to, once again, look at a wide variety of compliance policies that we've talked about when we take a look at data lifecycle management and information protection, specifically around labels and policies. We have a whole video that talks about labels and policies. Under endpoint protection, you might have heard of a product called Intune, which gets into the mobile application management and mobile device management for protecting the data and application use. And finally, under identity, you're going to have a whole set of protections around conditional access for managing Copilot for Microsoft 365 access to data. Under identity governance, where we talked about privileged identity management and lifecycle workflows. So just a brief introduction about some of the interfaces and the tools that are available for you to manage information protection. Let's go back to the lesson.
Welcome back. We've now completed our journey through governance controls of data. We've looked at in other recordings around governance controls around identities, but at the data journey we've taken a look at, we've understood that there is a philosophy that you want to put in place that allows you to gather the information. You want to have a protection plan around the data that you've now got and the information around that data, and then have a prevention plan for the loss of that data. Wide variety of tools. Now, an important part around this is specifically, as we mentioned throughout this, is the access by Copilot for M365. It, can't say it enough that anything that you put in place to control access to data, whether it be at the data loss protection capabilities, whether it be at the access control, whether it be at the conditional access, whether it be at the identity, Copilot for M365 will honor all of those measures that you've put in place to restrict access to the data. And so this is a very important time in organizations, for me at least, I think, to go back and one, validate that the measures that they have in place are good. And maybe it's a great way to bring that level of security up to the standard that it needs to be, because maybe there's some vulnerabilities. And so this is going to be a capability for you to go back and audit what you have in place, and that chance, because maybe no one ever had time or effort or whatever it wasn't a priority. This is a great way as we start to open up this data to be exposed in a new manner. It is really truly going to make your business more successful in the use of that data, because the more knowledge that you can bring into your decision making, the more powerful the decisions you make can be. And the speed in which it can happen. So as you expose this to more and more users, attack surfaces, and attack surface doesn't always mean it's a bad thing. You just got to take a look at all those attack surfaces, and the smaller you can reduce that attack surface, the less likely of it being a breach environment for you. But your now data is going to be exposed in a massive level, and potentially, if it does get overshared, the influence or the blast radius of that kind of impact can be significantly greater. So follow these measures. Take a dive into other videos if you want to understand how to do each one of these concepts that I've covered in this video at a deeper level. To find out the actual implementations of those technologies would be great. But hopefully this has given you a view of what it is that you can do so you can feel comfortable in the deployment and then the use of Copilot for Microsoft 365 in your organization. I look forward to seeing you in another video. Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Tickleman, and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. I'm here today to inform you on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today I'll be focusing on Copilot for Microsoft 365 data governance. The product and features that will be discussed are current as of the time of this recording. And because of the rapid rate of change in technologies, I encourage you to reference the product documentation to get the most current information on the features and functions that are available. Let's get into this. Continuing this data governance model, we're going to be taking a look at what we can do from a lifecycle management. We've talked before about the creation, the use, through to the destruction of those objects and managing that data throughout that lifecycle we're dealing with. So we'll take a look at the components of a lifecycle management. We'll get into the actual results of working with what are called policies and labels and the comparison, so you can understand building a proper data governance model throughout the lifecycle of the data itself. When you take a look at the overview of the lifecycle management, you want to think about this hierarchical structure that certain things win over others. What happens if there's a conflict? So for example, retentions win over deletions. So if you have two policies and they're in conflict, retention will always win over a deletion. Longest retentions periods win over shorter. So if I've got two classifications, and we'll show you how classifications can happen multiple levels on the same object. So know that, retentions win over deletions, longer wins over shorter. Explicit inclusion wins over implicit inclusion. So if you inherit a characteristic, and we do this in one of our demonstrations in Copilot for Microsoft 365, that it generated a new document based around another document. So that was an implicit inclusion in a data classification as governance. So an explicit inclusion wins over a potential implicit inclusion that you're working with. And so again, if it's an implicit long versus a short, those will going to have a conflict. And so you've got to understand what the end results of having all of these policies applied potentially at different levels, how they might affect specific objects. And you need to go through and not just in your head, make sure that they work. You want to validate this by actually performing some of these activities against test data across these different conflict zones that you might have to make sure that the desired results are going to be attained. When you take a look at that personal lifecycle management, we have retention strategies that you're working with. And you want to set up, again, either corporately from a governance perspective, and some of this may be covered by maybe something like GDPR or HIPAA regulations here in North America. You may have governance that are forced on you by an industry or government environment that you're dealing with. They talk about these 5 categories of data down that left-hand side of personal data, personal sensitive data that you might have. We take a look at product data, authentication data that you have. And so all these different categories and then examples of what that data might look like. So again, this assessment done up front can be a heavy lift job, but before you start exposing your data to Copilot for Microsoft 365, absolutely understand that that could be a scary thing, but it is actually the best thing. And if you haven't done this already, you've got to start this journey because your data and your organization are going to be exposed, regardless if you make this available to Copilot for Microsoft 365. Make sure that these policies are in place. It's just good practice. And then by having those good practices in place, you then feel comfortable and confident that your information is going to be protected now that it's included as part of an overall M365 solution, by allowing Copilot for Microsoft 365 to be part of that business processing function that you have within your data state. When you take a look at a variety of tools, and I'm trying to use general terms as opposed to specific tools as we go through these examples, to be able to do some of these features. For example, governance applies to a series of tools that will fall into identity management and data governance that we're taking a look at. Now, specifically, at the time of this recording, tools that we might be using for that might be Purview for some of the data governance, and identity management might be done by Microsoft Entra ID. Who knows? It could be something else down the road, but the concepts of identity management, data governance, all fall under, regardless of the concept of the tool that you're going to use to implement these. So you want to be able to automate as much as possible, and you're getting some of the tools down that left-hand side for retaining your data that's available. And this goes beyond the regular backups that you might have been using, but there's data retention capabilities, for example, in an Azure storage account, that you have legal retention hold capabilities at the data itself. Now, this can be managed through policies within Azure that has policies that you could apply to say, this location is going to have this characteristic in its configuration. But I also want to maybe layer over top of that something like Purview to be the tool to manage some of this labeling and governance across my entire data set as opposed to just one portion of it. So we talk about a defense in depth model, and you don't want just one gatekeeper. You may want a layered approach in case one of them fails you at that point in time. It's got a backup or two to be able to make sure that that governance is going to come into play. The retention policies, those are separate from the retention of the data versus the backup and recovery and the archiving of the data. It could be part of the plan, but you do want to take a look at all these different features that you want to take a look at in that life cycle itself. Down the right-hand side, it gets into looking at, what is the right tool, to know to be able to do this. And I'm going to jump right to the bottom. Which requirements do you want to fulfill in your Microsoft 365? And specifically, as we're talking about Copilot for Microsoft 365, we want to not just have a perspective of my data in general and how I've used it in the past. I now want to consider an ongoing exposure of that data to a new environment. I gave an example in a previous one. You may want to have a data label or a retention label that says, can this be used within Copilot for M365 or can it? And it can be one of the policies that apply. And we took a look at that governance to say, longer over shorter wins, implicit versus explicit, how those come up, that you may want to start to add to an existing model that you might have already deployed for many years. You may want to layer over top of that a data governance model specifically for Copilot for Microsoft 365 to include the data exposures, the data retention that you may want to apply. Legal retention hold is one of the tools that we have available for us. Now, this is different from some of the other retention capabilities that you might have, that a legal retention hold says, not necessarily for legal requirements, but for a period of time, either legal or not, that you may need to keep that data beyond its normal life cycle management. And so, for example, you might have a company that were doing it for the life cycle of a patent that they had. Once it exceeded the patent requirements, the retention of that data didn't have to be as stringent as it was before. But because if any of them were in a legal retention requirement, because maybe they were being litigated, I needed a legal component to also go on top of it. So you might have one policy said that this data can be deleted after a certain period of time, but maybe a year before that period came up, it is now in a legal battle, and you might have a legal requirement to keep it for 7 years after the completion of the legal proceedings for a legal period. So while I'm using the legal term here, it is just a period that says it might even appear as deleted to regular users of that data, so it's not going to be part of their search results. Going back to Copilot for M365, we have data that might not be available to it because it might not appear to be available, but it is still part of your data estate, but it's just in a legal retention hold. And so take a look at what legal retention hold policies you might have and what the impact might be for the inclusion into Copilot for M365. Getting into the specifics between a retention policy and a retention label. Now, you'll see, and I want to focus in on that middle column, or the one that's in blue there, that talks about a retention policy applies to a location, and as long as an object appears in that location, that policy is going to apply. What happens if that document gets moved out of that location to another location? So they talk about, does it travel with the document itself? In that case, no. It's going to inherit possibly, or get explicitly defined, a policy in that new location. Where retention labels, on the other hand, says, I don't care where it lives, as long as it's got the label associated with it, the label will still be applied, indicating whatever that retention policy is going to be for that object. When you take a look at configuring your labels, you want to make sure that as much as possible, automation needs to play a big role in this. You do not want to have to rely on manual processes. Something should be able to govern this policy that regardless as data coming in or out of the environment, you're going to be able to feel comfortable that regardless of who does it or when it's done, these policies are going to apply. And so when you take a look at applying the labels, the administrator creates an auto-apply label to it. It gets deployed into the environments where you want that governance model to take place. And now as people use Office 365 or M365, part of the governance model that we want to take a look at, we've talked about automating the process as much as possible. You want to have a consistent implementation of that governance model, regardless of the location, the source, and the type of data that you're dealing with. And so what we have are a series of scopes, and we've talked about this in other lessons, that scopes talk about the sphere of influence that something might take place on. And we've talked about this through other governance models that we've covered, especially when we talked about in Azure and other lessons. So a scope becomes a range of objects that you deploy something to, like a policy or a label, and everything that falls inside of that scope would then have that label or the policy applied to it. When you take a look at a hierarchical set of scopes, if there's a parent-child relationship, a child object from a scope perspective below a parent scope object will typically inherit certain attributes like whatever's applied to the parent object that we're dealing with. And so here you can see that we've got some adaptive scopes broken up into the three areas of users, SharePoint sites, and M365 groups themselves. And so some of these groups are adaptive and can have membership in them added to or removed to dynamically. And so what then happens to those objects that adaptively get added to or removed to those objects? What is the impact on their use of services like data sources as they access them either in or out of that group membership? So take a look at what that scope is going to be and where you want to apply it to make sure that the sphere is going to impact the objects in an appropriate manner and that you're either not including or excluding people or locations inadvertently by scoping it to the wrong location. When you take a look at the differences between policies and labels, we've covered this a couple of times through here. Policies apply typically to those locations and labels apply to the objects. And we gave you an example earlier that, policies don't live with the objects. They, as they come into a sphere or scope or leave, they could potentially have that label gone. But there's a preservation lock, and this is something that we have in other Azure services as well, that if you lock an object, it prevents the potential change of that locked characteristic from changing until you have the capability to remove the lock and thereby then changing the object. Now this is recommended, and you'll hear a term sometimes referred to as separation of control, that a person who might have the ability to modify a policy or a label, that's their right. They have the permissions to be able to do that. But what I want to do is to make sure that they can't do that without the authoritative capability or the approvals to do this. And so in this case, what we might do is lock the object and give the control of the ability to lock it or unlock it to a different person. And so now I need two people in collusion to be able to override these retention policies or labels that you might configure. So I can add or remove policies, I can add or remove labels. I should not also be the person that can add or remove the lock. And that way, if they get locked and I need to be able to change that policy or label, I would have to go to someone else and say, could you please remove the lock so that I could now get in, make the change, and then you can lock the object again. So that's that separation of control or separation of concern to provide for a higher level of security just to implement in your governance model. So let's go off into a demonstration and show you some of these characteristics in use in the actual tool.
When it comes to retention policies, we want to start from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center and select Compliance. Once you're in the Compliance Center, there's several types of policies we want to take a look at. First, we have to be able to classify the data, and we've talked about this in other recordings, whether it be trainable classifiers, sensitive information types, or the exact data match. So we're going to be able to classify the data first. That's the first thing. And now we're going to set the retention policies. Scrolling down the left-hand side, there's two types of protection we want to take a look at. Data lifecycle management, specifically for Microsoft 365, we have retention policies that we can create. I'm going to create a retention policy, and this is just a demonstration to show you the settings that we can have. I'll just call it demo. These features we've talked about before. I just want to take a look at the type of retention policies that we can create. I can figure out the scope that I want to have of the retention. We can then decide on what kind of retention policy or deletion policy that we want to be able to cover. I'm not going to save this. The other type of policy we want to take a look at is the data loss prevention. And in here too, we have a set of policies that we can create. We've looked at this in another recording where we are able to create a policy. Instead of creating one, I'll go into one that I've already created, that you can define based around a data classification. So those are the major types of data protection that we have capable. Those are the two major features of compliance setting and data protection that we have available. Let's return back to the lesson.
Well, welcome back. What we showed you was an exercising of all these concepts that we showed you in lifecycle management in the demonstration, and showed you various tools that you can manage this through. Hopefully this is going to give you the confidence to be able to expose your data now to a Copilot for Microsoft 365 environment so that it can now be included in your data estate and making sure that you're getting accurate and grounded responses through Copilot for Microsoft 365. Thank you very much for joining me. I look forward to seeing you in a future recording. Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Tickleman and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. I'm here today to inform you on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today I'll be focusing on Copilot for Microsoft 365 data governance. The product and features that will be discussed are current as of the time of this recording. And because of the rapid rate of change in technologies, I encourage you to reference the product documentation to get the most current information on the features and functions that are available. Let's get into this. How is your data protected when using Microsoft Copilot? And how do you get ready for it? Over the next few minutes, I'll unpack how you can securely take advantage of generative AI across Microsoft 365 app experiences. I'll also go through the steps and resources to deploy it at scale. If you're new to Copilot for Microsoft 365, it lets you use natural language prompts to interact with your organization's data and generates personalized context and responds with relevant insights that are unique to your work context. While you only see the generated response in your original prompt, behind the scenes, Copilot for Microsoft 365 interprets your request and, if necessary, will find information you have access to within your organization, such as forms, work files sitting in SharePoint and OneDrive, or even email and calendar information via the Microsoft Graph. And even though none of this information is retained by the large language model, you will want to configure data security controls for use by Copilot for Microsoft 365. To securely take full advantage of generative AI, you can and should protect your data at every stage, from the information contained in your user's prompt to the information retrieved based on your user's access permissions, and the generated response itself, so that sensitive data is not inadvertently exposed when it shouldn't be. And the good news is controls for the security and privacy over your data exists at every stage, and will leverage the sensitivity labels and the corresponding policies that you've already got in place. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of the benefits of these data protection controls in action. Then I'll show you how to configure them yourself as an admin. Remember, this is just an overview. There are other recordings that detail everything I'm about to demonstrate. Taking from those other topics, there's some tips that you want to start with that I'll be demonstrating as we go through this. Before we get into the topics of how Copilot for Microsoft 365 uses data security, we want to have a couple of the data preparation tips in mind. I've listed a couple of them here for you. You want to clean out any redundant or old data. Make sure that old files are not sitting around. You want to organize your files and folders in a way that people are not going to gain access to information that they shouldn't. You want to tag files for keywords. There's a whole set of topics, as I said, we'll cover in the data security components that are covered in other recordings. You also want to make sure that you're preventing oversharing, making sure that people only have specific access to the specific information that they need. We'll take a look at things like conditional access that use features of Microsoft Identity Management to be able to control that oversharing capability. Using Copilot for Microsoft 365, I'll prompt it to list the key points from the Contoso purchase agreement. And the information that was retrieved shows the sensitivity label for the document that was referenced. To be clear, this is a file that I have explicit access to. If I move over the source document itself, you can see the confidential sensitivity label, which has previously been applied to it. You saw how Copilot was able to inform me of the sensitivity label of the document that it retrieved, all as part of the response. Let's see how this works for content generated using Microsoft Word. I'm going to prompt Copilot in Word to generate a confirmation letter that's based on the same purchase agreement with the sensitivity label that I just showed you. Right after I reference the protected document, you'll see that with this shield icon, it immediately recognized this is a sensitive file. Now I'm going to hit Generate, and it will author a draft confirmation letter for the purchase agreement. Notice that when it's completed the confirmation letter, because the originating document was a confidentially labeled document, that same label is automatically applied to the generated file as shown in the information bar above the document. The protection is inherited from the labeled source material. Taking a pause to take a look at some of the secure components that you could build before you start your Copilot for Microsoft 365 journey, we have a wide variety of tools that we'll be covering in other recordings that talk about information protection, sensitivity labels, things like conditional access, and privileged identity management. We also cover off the Zero Trust security model. This is well adopted and documented through Microsoft, where you verify explicitly, you use the least permission, and you assume breach. As an admin, what does it take to protect your data? It starts by looking at the data access permissions and applying the principles of just enough access, as well as least privilege for information across your entire data estate. One of the first recommended steps that you can take to protect Microsoft 365 is to review SharePoint sites access, prioritizing the sites containing the most sensitive information. You can start by looking for sites that have their privacy set to public, which means that all employees can discover and access information in them. From here, you can require that site owners verify an ownership, as well as they should be able to confirm membership of visitors or other users to the site and limit their access to it. Then for content classification and labeling, one of the simplest controls that you can put in place is to classify files automatically saved to sensitive locations, as you can see here with the site owner controls for this document library. That means that any content created in that location will get labeled, applied to them automatically, and corresponding policies can lock files down to the right people. An easy thing to do to test permissions is to use Search for Microsoft 365 to evaluate whether different users can discover and access sites or files that they should not have access to. The labels and classifications applied in these locations are configured and managed through Microsoft data protection tools such as Microsoft Purview. Let me show you these controls as well as some additional more advanced controls to protect your data using Purview's auto-labeling and data loss prevention capabilities. The labels you apply in Microsoft Purview can automatically help you discover, limit the shared radius, and apply encryption directly using policies. These can also be applied based on the content within the document using data loss prevention or DLP policies with sensitive information types. For example, I've started a DLP policy for the personally identifiable information. I've added a few sensitivity information types already. I can add even more than over 300 optional ones for things like banking numbers, addresses, identification types, tax information, and more. Additionally, using trainable classifiers, there are dozens of built-in document types that you can choose from, including source code, healthcare, HR, and more, to auto-apply labels. Moving on to device restrictions, I can also set up endpoint DLP or data loss protection policies to prevent users from copying sensitive data to their clipboard and then, for example, into unapproved sites. Beyond data protection policies, Copilot for Microsoft 365 activities can all be audited. Using the content search for Microsoft Purview, all activity for Copilot for Microsoft 365 is discoverable, as you can see here. Retention policies can also be used to retain content, prompts, and responses based on your requirements. E-discovery is also supported for Copilot interactions, as you can see here with this case example. Communication and compliance will likewise flag any content with established policy matches, like the one that we see here for codename Obsidian. Data residency for Copilot for Microsoft 365 is consistent with Microsoft 365's policies, which means that if your organization is based in the European Union, your Copilot data is likewise stored and processed within the EU data boundaries, like the rest of your data. Additionally, the Copilot for Microsoft 365 copyright commitment means that content generated using Copilot also comes with legal protections from Microsoft. Taking a look at step number 3 in your data security journey before you actually start deploying, you want to assign Copilot for Microsoft 365 licenses. And we have the steps here that will also be covered in the configuration component of the administration recording. You want to make sure that license management is not extended to people that don't need to use this tool. You also want to review your M365 licenses to make sure people are using it properly and make sure it meets with the corporate governance requirements of your organization for Copilot for Microsoft 365 use. Let's move on to how you can fine-tune policy settings and configurations for Copilot as an admin. This is done from within the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, including links to many of the tools and concepts I've shown today. Here you can see the status of your Copilot assignments, as well as the latest information on Copilot. Under Settings, you can find what you need to manage Copilot experiences, from Bing to Edge browsers and Windows, as well as deep links to many of the data security and compliance controls. You also have admin controls to submit feedback based around Copilot for Microsoft 365 services on behalf of your users. There are configurations for plugins and their permissions from the integrated apps page, as well as tenant-wide controls to allow the public web to be accessed as grounding data for your Copilot for Microsoft 365 experience and more. With protections and configurations in place, this means that you can take full advantage of generative AI and start deploying Copilot for Microsoft 365 services at scale. To deploy Copilot capabilities in Microsoft 365 apps, use the Microsoft 365 App Admin Center to deploy either the monthly enterprise, current channel, or current channel preview capabilities. From your Microsoft 365 Admin Center setup, you can use the Get Ready for Microsoft Copilot for Microsoft 365 setup guide to configure any remaining items. And it walks you through many of the steps I just presented to prepare your organization. You can even assign Copilot licenses to users and groups in scope for your deployments and send welcome letters to help them get ready and start their Copilot journey. The Copilot Hub at adoption.microsoft.com/Copilot gives you additional resources by role to help users learn about and get the most out of their Copilot experience. This has been an overview of how security and privacy with Copilot for Microsoft 365 works, and how you can get ready for Copilot in your organization. I hope that you have a better understanding of how provisioning Copilot for Microsoft 365 works. Make sure to check out the other overview sessions on Copilot for Microsoft 365, as well as full sessions detailing how you can deploy, configure, and secure Copilot for Microsoft 365, as well as restrict access to and classify the type of organizational data an individual can have access to while using Copilot for Microsoft 365. Thanks again, and I hope to see you at a future recording. Hello, and welcome. I'm Bob Tickleman, and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. I'm here today to inform you on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today, I'll be focusing on Copilot for Microsoft 365 data governance. The product and features that will be discussed are current as of the time of this recording. And because of the rapid rate of change in technologies, I encourage you to reference the product documentation to get the most current information on the features and functions that are available. Let's get into this. So looking at sensitive information types, we want to be able to then identify the type of objects, and those objects might be files in file folders. They could be the folders themselves. They could be databases, and there's all these different storage locations that information may exist. It may be existent in transit. It may be existent at rest. And so we've got all these different states, and we want to be able to identify the information in those different states or locations that you're dealing with. We've got some built-in tools that we'll be showing you. We've got some custom sensitivity information types that we're going to show you how to build. We've got information fingerprinting to be able to then identify those characteristics of those objects so that we could then put a policy against them for your information protection. When you take a look at the two types of sensitive information types that we'll take a look at in the demonstration, they break up into those two major categories. The built-in on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see that there's this growing list listed currently at over 260 sensitive information types. It could be health information, it could be credit card information, national identity numbers. All of these things are well identified and can be categorized based around these built-in sensitivity categories. There's some default patterns that are managed by Microsoft. Some are coming in from external government regulations that we then implement, and that list will continually grow. On the right-hand part of the slide, you're going to see that there is custom sensitive information that you could actually run a query, and I'll do this in the demonstration, that you can actually have it go out, find the data source, actually ingest that information from an analysis perspective, and then allow you to categorize that information if it doesn't fall into one of these 260 plus built-in information types that it can identify. So there's keyword dictionaries you're working with, as I said, the document fingerprinting, ways to identify it like a fingerprint so that you could then apply a data governance model to those objects. When you want to build custom sensitive information types, I'm going to be doing this in the demonstration in just a few minutes. You're going to be able to go in and categorize some of these major features. We'll go in and create a primary pattern, and then you can have some additional evidence that you can apply to that categorization. I'm going to give you an example, not a fairly good one possibly. What is the file location? Then based on a name structure that goes along with it. Is it following a name structure? But what happens if people don't name it on that structure? It could be based on file types that go along with it. So there's all these different additional evidences that you can apply to give a high level of confidence that an object that needs to be protected somehow is going to meet the requirements of that sensitive information typing, that it could identify it correctly to have the right governance applied to it. There's things like character proximity, that if these words are found closely together, and you can define what that closeness is and what the characters are all things that you can do to make sure that you are identifying objects correctly to be able to have that categorized as a specific information type that then could receive a label that then could have a policy applied to it. A keyword dictionary is a great way to be able to identify objects, and they're giving you an example of .txt's versus .csv's, understanding that they have different file formats, but you can have very secure information in a text format. You could have a CSV appear in a TXT, it's just that you're not going to get the comma-separated values as clearly defined. But what we want to be able to do is, find the information, be able to categorize it correctly to build this dictionary. You can see some numbers that are in there, support up to 1 megabyte of terms after compression. And so what you're going to see is a way to define attributes against the object. And one of the recommendations is to categorize as much as you possibly can and reach these limits wherever possible to correctly identify the objects that you're trying to identify. So creating a custom dictionary, and this can also be helped with you scanning in that custom sensitivity label, scanning the data source, getting that information, because sitting in a room sometimes trying to come up with what you think that that custom dictionary might look like can be somewhat limiting, because there's going to be file types that you didn't think about that maybe preceded you in your existing that organization, so you don't know to include them into this dictionary of keywords that you want to build. When you take a look at the sensitive information types with extracted data match, this is going to be an example that I'll be doing in the demonstration. I'm going to focus and explore against a data source, and it will then ingest that information. And so the ability, you can see it brings up to 100 million rows of sensitive data. You've got 12 columns that brings in the fields per data source that you're working with. So we've got this great capability to bring in metadata that we could then use to build the custom sensitive labels that we want to build to identify the objects. To implement document fingerprinting, you want to start off with an empty template document and then be able to start loading the fingerprint characteristics into that document, and then be able to make sure it's categorizing that document based around the fingerprints that you want to use to categorize it. The more that you can identify about the object to be able to fingerprint it, the more likely you are to have that categorization happen correctly. You can define fields in the document fingerprinting process, whether the fields are required, are they optional in that fingerprinting process, to give you that level of confidence in the fingerprinting process. When you take a look at trainable classifiers, and I'll be doing this again in the demonstration, it includes several steps that you're going to first and foremost have to go off to a SharePoint library and ingest that information to be able to train from. Once you've ingested that, and when we do the demonstration, you'll see it takes anywhere from several hours to 24 hours potentially, depending on the volumes of data that you're trying to ingest. I'll skip through that in the demonstration, but I'll start the process, and then, like a cooking show, we'll jump out to the end results. Through that process, you're going to then review the items and then improve the classification based around the general recommendations that it's going to make through that ingestion process. So there's a way for you to be able to point to a directory, ingest all the data that's in there. It will make some suggestions for you that you could then review and modify from that point to meet your specific data governance requirements. As we started earlier, we talked about there are custom classifiers, things to identify, the built-in or default classifiers. They could be from that long list that we mentioned of identifiable types of data, whether it be a social insurance number, social security number, national identity number, a driver's license, whether it be a credit card information. So we have all these different default built-in classifiers. And again, we have the ability to build custom classifiers against that trained data that you could then have your data needs met based around your knowledge of your data. Maybe you're a research company and you've got language types that are very specific to you to build that keyword dictionary that could then be used as a custom classifier. We've talked about several classifications and sensitive information types that you can use to identify the data you're dealing with. And so this is a great chart that shows whether it's sensitive information versus trainable classification, and across 4 different categories down that left-hand side. And just for an example, you take a look at the term schema. A schema is just a definition of a series of well-defined structured objects. If you're used to databases, a schema might say, in this data table, I've got a first name that is alphanumeric characters to 26 characters long. I've got a last name that is X number of characters. I've got an address that can be alphanumeric to this number. So a schema is a well-defined set, and so you can use that sensitive information type to identify those objects versus trainable classifications. These become, algorithms, machine learning components that you might use to go off and learn how to detect those objects themselves. The type of content that you're looking at, so detecting the content itself, you'll see that decision tree of, do I have certain types of information that would lend itself to be more of a sensitive information type versus trainable classifications that we can work with. So let's go off and do the demonstration now to take a look at protecting sensitive data types. We'll take a look first at detecting sensitive information. We'll apply controls to that data, and then we'll investigate suspicious activities against it. So let's go off and do that demonstration.
There's several ways to get to Compliance Manager, but you need to be at the portal to be able to manage all the topics we're going to cover in this module. But let's go into the classifiers. The three major types of classifiers are trainable classifiers, sensitive type information, and EDM classifiers. The trainable classifiers are covered separately. In this module, we covered the sensitive information types. It was mentioned that there's over 250 different predefined data sensitivity types based around known data structures that you may want to incorporate into your labels. I want to go ahead and show you how to create a data sensitivity type. When creating a data sensitivity type, click on Create Sensitive Information Type, and they have a wizard that will step you through the different parts that you need. In my example, I'm going to create a sensitive information type to identify Contoso employee IDs. And I'll give it a friendly descriptor. Say next. I then need to create the pattern that I want to match. I'm going to add a primary element as a regular expression. I then need to put in the expression to match the alphanumeric characters and the number that they're going to have for each. So letters A to Z for 3, and then 0 to 9 for 6. I then want to add some supporting elements as a key list, encasing sensitive employee ID. Say done, and then create. I've created my pattern. You can add multiple patterns if you want. I'll accept the default for high confidence level, review my information, and then create. I've successfully created my sensitive information type, and it should now be listed amongst the pre-built or default patterns that we have. See a lot of national IDs for driver's license and passport numbers. Some Azure components. Let's go down to Contoso, and there's my Contoso employee ID. There's some quite elaborate pattern matching if you want to read the Microsoft documentation to figure out how to do it. You also can look up the documentation on how to do an exact data match, and then the trainable classifiers. But that's what I wanted to show you was sensitivity labels, and think of them in the form of a copilot for Microsoft 365 that you might want to classify data for its use within the copilot ecosystem. Let's return back to the lesson.
So welcome back. What we saw through that demonstration was the ability to detect what sensitive information might be. And we did that within the context of Copilot for Microsoft 365 and being able to have that information be accessible to its response generation capabilities. And so hopefully you now see why it's important that we get this right, because you can either overexpose or overshare information through an improper classification of the data types and its exposure through Copilot for Microsoft 365. Thanks for joining me in this video, and I hope to see you again at a future video on data protection. Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Tickleman, and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. I'm here today to inform you on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today I'll be focusing on Copilot for Microsoft 365 data governance. The product and features that will be discussed are current as of the time of this recording. And because of the rapid rate of change in technologies, I encourage you to reference the product documentation to get the most current information on the features and functions that are available. Let's get into this. As we've talked about managing the data governance across a series of these recordings, we've talked about probably some traditional manners that you might be familiar with, at least at an introductory level, on what it might mean to you. We want to take a look at a concept called an information barrier that you can set up between the groups in your organization that might inadvertently share information that they shouldn't have access to. So we're going to take a look at information barriers across Microsoft Teams, OneDrive, and SharePoint, not just from a collaboration of the tools, but remember, all of this has been done with the focus of taking a look at Copilot for M365 and its use and the ability to include data into prompt results for the AI services of Copilot for M365. When you take a look at an information barrier within M365, it's the ability to set up groups in your organization and control the sharing of information between those groups, even though they're part of the same organization. Now, this is layered over top of access control permissions that you might have and some of the other data loss protections, and all of these different pieces fit together. But even though that somebody may not have the information available to them, so for example, I'll talk about the group in the upper left-hand corner, they may not have access to that information, but the people in HR might have that information, and they may share it inadvertently through maybe a team share with a group of people that might not have access to that information. So this is an important part of that overall perspective of taking a look at how you can ingest data into a Copilot for M365 and protecting that information from being overshared. When you take a look at planning the information barrier policies, you want to take a look at and use a concept called least privilege and secure by default. By default, no one should be able to talk to anybody. And it's the easiest way, as opposed to saying everybody can talk to everybody and trying to lock things down. And so by allowing nothing to happen by default and then opening up your model to expose things that are allowed is probably a better model than saying, wow, I didn't expect those two groups to talk to each other, and I now have to add that to my barrier to stop that from happening in the future because it's been, a leak or a breach of that. So use that concept of secure by default and the ability to say no one can talk to anybody anywhere, and think about maybe opening these things up versus trying to close them down, which inevitably the obvious ones are blocked, and it's those ones that you never thought of that might take place that are going to be the ones that cause you some problems. So you want to go through and keep that legal and industry regulations to see if that's going to be there, who can talk to which groups. Separate policies into a block versus an allow. And so know that you might want to, going to the example I gave you, don't block something because blocks actually prevent it. So typically in most security models, if I have an allow and a block, the block will take precedence in that order of operation. And so using the model I just talked about, you want to think about have these groups and have the information that categorized to them. By default, no one is allowed to share that information except within that group. And you might want to allow for maybe a team is going to come in, maybe IT is going to help HR work on a project for a period of time. They need to share some information. Maybe you allow it for a period of time and then take that feature away. So taking a look at those information barriers as a way to protect the data from accidental oversharing is a good concept to be able to get and take a look at. I'm going to jump out and do a demonstration of this and see what the impact is using M365 and specifically around Copilot for M365. So let's go to that demonstration.
To configure information barriers from the Microsoft 365 admin portal, select Compliance. Once you're in the compliance portal, down the left-hand side, go down to information barriers. The first thing you're going to need to configure is the segments within your organization. I've only created 2 currently, IT and marketing. You would create the characteristics of who is in that group. In my case, I've selected a user attribute for department. Marketing would dynamically assign them to that group. Once you've got all your segments configured, you then go in and configure the policies. Again, in this case, I've created a policy, marketing to IT. Selecting the policy, you can see that I've created it as inactive, and it has allowed communications between marketing and IT. You can change this from inactive to active by selecting the policy, selecting to edit the policy, step through to activate the policy, which would now allow for that communication. Do read the documentation, because there are a number of cases where information barriers do not work, especially with federation if you've got that configured. But I just wanted to give you a quick demonstration of how to set up an information barrier to either allow or block communication between groups. Let's return to the lesson.
Welcome back. So information barriers, another tool in your tool belt that you have to create a secure environment to categorize and protect your data states, and take a look at all of the different interactions. And maybe it's not a direct interaction to the data which you've protected with RBAC permissions or some other type of policies, but it's through this sharing of information as the modern way in which people are working through SharePoint and Teams and OneDrive, collaborating throughout your organization. So take a look at information barriers as a tool in your tool belt that you might want to use as you start to think about opening up your data estate to be used by Copilot for M365. I hope you enjoyed this recording. I look forward to seeing you at a future recording. Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Tickleman, and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. I'm here today to inform you on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today I'll be focusing on Copilot for Microsoft 365 data governance. The product and features that will be discussed are current as of the time of this recording. And because of the rapid rate of change in technologies, I encourage you to reference the product documentation to get the most current information on the features and functions that are available. Let's get into this. As an introduction to data governance, we want to do a look at what is information protection and some of the components that make up data classifications. We'll show you some of the cards that are available for data classifications. As well, we'll show you the Content Explorer and the Activity Explorer as tools to start that data governance journey. The data estate can be vast in an organization that covers everything from on-premises, within Azure, or other clouds. And so we want to be able to classify data by, first of all, understanding what data is and where it lives. And so we're seeing these different components of Overview, Content Explorer, Activity Explorer, sensitivity info types, and trainable classifications are components that we're going to demonstrate to you in this module, and what they can do for you in that whole data governance model as you set it up to control access to the data for Copilot for Microsoft 365. And by protecting your data up front, therefore, the searches will be more relevant, as well as secure, that you're making sure that people are not getting unauthorized access to the data. When you take a look at what is called sensitive information and labels, we've got to be able to identify the kind of information, whether it be file names or the information that lives in the file or the file location, as a way to categorize what is protected data. Is it general internal data? Is it secure information data? Is it secret information? Now, those words may sound the same, but they're actually somewhat different. And when we take a look at a sphere of influence, we talk about public data, and truly public data. It's viewable by anybody. We then take a look from a security perspective of this thing called realms. And I make a jump from the public realm into the private realm. Private realm takes from publicly available data, but your company maybe, and makes it available only to certain, the individuals inside of your organization. And then we start to have to drill down even further. While everybody in the company may be able to get to see the menu of the cafeteria, not everybody is going to be able to see the research information from the drug research that you're working on. Not everybody's going to see all the HR files. So all of these different rings, we go from public to private to secure to secret as general rings that you go through. And you have to be able to classify the data to provide these labeling systems to easily identify groups of objects and have a general policy applied to them. When we take a look at using information types, we want to take a look at being able to protect the information. And using auto-labeling policies will then apply a policy or a set of governance rules to those objects that got the label. Now, you want to auto-label as much as possible and then possibly layer on top of that some manual components that go along with it with other policies. Other types of information protection is a thing called data loss protection. What can I do in a DLP or data loss policy that I could now put out to say, what happens if someone accidentally deletes this? Things like legal retention hold. What happens with someone opening up on a phone some secure information? And yes, you could even put policies on top of that to say, you can't cut and copy that information. And short of taking a camera up and taking a picture of it, there's not going to be any way that someone could take that information from a secure location and transfer it to an unsecured data storage location. We also want to take a look at a thing called data life management. And that talks about how do we manage through the creation, the use, and then eventual destruction of that data to manage it through its entire life cycle to make sure that there's no gaps in your data protection policies. We then take a look at the overall records management and being able to apply data for, is it for long-term storage, archival storage, and all these different pieces. So these are some general categories that we want to take a look at the overall data estate. And you want some well-defined corporate policies, and some may be enforced on you by your industry or government regulations on what some of these numbers might have to be. When you take a look at the tool, and I'll do this in a demonstration shortly, we have some predefined sensitivity labels that you can allocate to your data policies that would then get applied to data that lived in locations or met the certain criteria of the policy itself. And so this is going to be your ability to then filter based around those sensitivity labels that you have associated with them. And by having the label applied to it, you then can have a policy applied. So you need to make that distinction between what a label is, just allocating a data file as a type of data, and not necessarily the policy that is applied to it based around the label itself. You then want to take a look at Activity Explorer that is going to provide some visibility into the kind of access and use case that that data may be exposed to. Visibility of the document level of activities like label changes and label downgrades or upgrades and how it manages that life cycle. Has someone inadvertently changed or intentionally tried to change those data labels that go on those objects and now don't have policies applied to them? The ability to filter and see these. So taking a look at all the activities and managing that component is a big part of the overall lifecycle management that I mentioned on that first slide. So let's go out and do a demonstration of an introduction to the data governance tools that we'll be using and show you the activities of some of these features that we just covered.
I want to give you an overview of the 4 areas that we just discussed, specifically information protection, data loss prevention, data lifecycle management, and records management. From your Microsoft 365 admin console, you want to launch compliance. This will bring you into the portal where we have the 4 areas we want to take a look at. Starting off in the overview page for data classification, you get to see the deployments that you have of your trainable classifiers, your sensitive information. They don't show them right now because we don't have them deployed, but the exact data match data classifiers. This is where you'd set up the classifiers for their trainable classifications, sensitive information, and your exact data match. This is also where we can take a look at your Content Explorer, where it will give you a detailed view of the different sensitive information types you've deployed and the number of records that match that. We see the 4 areas that they apply to of Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams, and the number of items in each one of them. Scrolling down further on the left-hand menu side, this is where we're going to get into data loss prevention, and similar to data classification, I have an overview page that gives me a summary of the data loss prevention policies that have been applied. Taking a look at the policies specifically, we can see that I have a number of policies deployed, and this is where I would build and create my policies. All of these topics are covered in detail in separate recordings. Scrolling further down, I can get into my data lifecycle management for Microsoft 365, and in here I'll get into the data lifecycle management overview, as well as being able to get in and deal with my retention policies of how long I want to keep records for, the labels that I'm going to use to identify the retention policy, and the label policies for the application of the labels. Scrolling down to the final item, we see records management, and similar to the previous 3, I've got an overview page where I can get in my file plans, my label policies, and the adaptive scopes. So just an overview of the control plane for us to be able to manage the 4 areas we covered in the lesson. Let's return to it now.
So welcome back. We understand that information protection as a component of data governance is the first step that you should have in your information protection journey. Being able to classify and identify based around corporate governance requirements how data needs to be identified and then protected. I talked about the rings of public, private, secure, and secret as a starting point for your definition of those 4 realms in which you may want to bucket or put categories in your information. And even within that, you might have within your public, private, secure, secure to HR, secure to payroll, secure to research. They may have even sub-rings that fall into them all the way down to a secret level. And what happens is the level of control as well as the level of auditing that takes place on those objects typically go in an inverse relationship. So the more control the less access that you want to grant to something, the more auditing that you want to have on it to make sure that that secure and secret information is truly being accessed the way it was meant to be. So that's a brief introduction to your start of a data governance journey. We hope to see you again in another security module. Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Tickleman and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. I'm here today to inform you on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today I'll be focusing on Copilot for Microsoft 365 data governance. The product and features that will be discussed are current as of the time of this recording. And because of the rapid rate of change in technologies, I encourage you to reference the product documentation to get the most current information on the features and functions that are available. Let's get into this. So when we talk about zero trust, it is a concept that has been well defined over many years at Microsoft. And while it's used generally, we're going to take a look at some of its concepts in relationship to Copilot for Microsoft 365. So we're going to talk about what it is. We're going to take a look at how do you deploy a zero trust model. And we'll do some demonstrations generally, but know that in other learnings, we're going to have the specific steps to execute each one of them, whether it be data protection, identity and access policies. This is just to introduce you to those concepts, and you'll see that there's a little over 7 of them that have specific phases as part of the zero trust model. So let's get into this. When you take a look at another term called defense in depth, zero trust is just a part of this. And defense in depth is a broader security document that we talk about that deals with everything from physical security of buildings down to the layered approach that you want to have in the deployment of security all the way through to your data, the value piece in the model that you're dealing with. And so we actually have a defense in depth architecture as part of the Microsoft Copilot for Microsoft 365. And you're seeing this diagram here, and it's broken up into small pieces, and you'll see those pieces. I won't zoom in, But at the top of it, you have your users, so some identities. We've got our applications that we have that are available in Microsoft 365. And then in the center of that diagram, we start getting into some of these concepts that we've talked about as part of that Microsoft graph, the ecosystem of all your data that you're dealing with and being able to connect to it. In the other lessons, as far as Copilot for Microsoft 365 went, we talked about having semantic indexing that comes off of this graph information that you're dealing with, and that way that you can pipe into it. And this is really what we're going to take a look at, is that bottom part of the diagram where we start looking at all the repositories of data that we have. So just a small diagram. If you look at the Defense in Depth for Copilot, you can actually find this article and that diagram in it. Now, taking a look at the deployment of this model, I'm going to go into each one of these 7 topics very specifically. And when we take a look at a zero trust model, it says, how do we start from a position of trust and open a system up to make sure it's secure? Now, this is a fundamental difference than has been dealt with for many years before, where people would have an open system and they would try and lock it down. And there would always be these gaps and holes. And so what we want to start with is zero trust to say, how do we build from, it's secure by default, no one has access anywhere, and we're going to start to open things up to the level that they need to. And if it needs to be opened up a bit more, that's a more secure position to be from than trying to find out that you've had a data breach and you're now figuring out where it was and then trying to find ways to lock it down. So each one of these stages, if you want to take a look at the types of components of a zero trust model, because there's 3 features of them, you'll see which components of the zero trust premise that you're dealing with down that right-hand column in each of these 7 stages. Let's go into the first of them. So when you take a look at deploy or validate, because we don't know if you've got one already, and if you don't, you do definitely want to go through and deploy something that is a starting point. But in many of your organizations, hopefully they are doing some of this already. And what you now want to potentially do is, and I'll try and focus specifically around Copilot for Microsoft 365, some of the things that you might want to go back to your data protection people and say, have you thought about this? And so when you talk about data protection in general, it covers a series of components that you want to be able to trust but verify. So you'll see a component in there for auditing. So you're going to build a model that is going to identify the types of data that you're working with and how you want to protect it. Do I need encryption? What kind of encryption? Is it encryption at rest? Is it encryption in flight? So there's a whole series of topics that each one of these has a great deal amount of documentation and learning that you can go. We're not going to get into it in this module. We'll actually have some other recordings that cover each of these topics and technologies in depth in relationship to Copilot for Microsoft 365. We're going to take a look at data classifications, customer keys, the encryption capabilities you're dealing with, and how do you generate those keys and how do you store them, the communications compliance that you're dealing with, and setting up rules about how we communicate inwardly within our organization and outwardly. These are all components of that data protection. We have the e-discovery from a legal component. We have content search capabilities. And so all of these are features. I'll go into a demonstration right now and take a look at some of the data protection capabilities.
Now, when we talk about data, it is usually referring to your data estate, which is much larger than some of the areas that you control through Microsoft 365. I'm going to go in, and from the admin portal, I'm going to come into compliance. This is where we'll do a lot of our personal data management. For example, coming under data classification, this is where I can get into my classifiers to create the sensitive label types, as well as the trainable classifiers. You'll see that I've also got data connections. This is where you're going to be able to take control of non-Microsoft data, so data outside of your Microsoft 365 environment. Scrolling down, this is where we're going to be able to see also the ability to manage some of the other features like auditing, content search, communications compliance, data loss prevention, e-discovery, all topics that were covered in the lesson. Managed through the governance portal through the Microsoft 365 admin console would allow you to do the data protection portion of your governance. Let's go back to the lesson.
Okay, so welcome back from that demonstration. Hopefully you've now seen kind of the broad spectrum of what it is that we're talking about the data protection options that are available to us. Let's go to the second stage of the recommendations for that zero trust model, and that's going to be able to deploy or validate. Once again, hopefully you're doing some of these, if not all of them, in your organizations currently. This is the ability to actually work with identity management, and this is the user accounts. In a previous video, I've talked about the ability of modern identity in Azure that we provide. And your M365 tenant, your Microsoft 365 tenant that you have, is backed by a tenant within Azure. So they are one and the same that you're dealing with. And we have a series of components that are available that provide that identity. We've got users and groups that we've had for years, but they're now done with a new protocol. We have a wide range of new identities that we're working with managed identities, whether it be system assigned or user assigned. So we want to have a whole set of governance around the identities, which is the authentication and authorization part that allows a user to prove who they are. And you'll see a number of these features that are in there. And we'll get into the one is just enough administration. And this is locking people down. Gone are the days where if you are a high-level administrator that maybe has access to DNS and maybe Exchange and some other services, you can't use that user account to be able to do everything that you do, all those administration jobs, and it's also the account that you use to get your email like a regular user. So being able to classify your users at a very specific level, and we're going to show you how you can get to an elevated permission set for a limited period of time to be able to do something, and that falls under one of the other bullet points you see there, the privileged identity management, or PIM. You know, we have multi-factor authentication that you're going to come up with a thing called conditional access that says, hey, you know, Bob, you know, in a secure environment doing just regular stuff doesn't need multi-factor authentication. We'll just accept his user account and password as his authentication. But if Bob needs to maybe exercise for a short period of time an administrative capability, that just enough access component would then allow him to maybe require a conditional access that says, hey, you know, it's great that you've logged in, but that was a couple of hours ago, but we want you to now provide multi-factor authentication to be able to perform these roles. So this is going to provide that access policies that you're working with. And a term that you might hear in this world is a bunch of RBAC, or role-based access control. And you'll see a lot of that as I get into this demonstration. So let's go there now.
When managing the identity and access policies from the Microsoft 365 admin portal, selecting the identities under the admin center will bring you into the admin portal for identities. It's through here that we're going to be able to not only manage the creation of users, groups, and devices and applications. We have several components here that we can work with for protection, identity protection, conditional access. You'll also see these down below under protection, identity protection, conditional access. So you'll see that they're very similar. If I get into conditional access here, it is the same set of features that I have here. But this is where we're going to be able to manage the multi-factor authentication, require multi-factor authentication based around conditional access. This is also where we can get into identity lifecycle management. This is done under identity governance, entitlement management, access reviews, privileged identity management, and the lifecycle workflows are all managed through the Entra Admin Center. Let's go back to the lesson.
Okay, welcome back. So we took a journey through that identity management piece and looked at the access policies that we have in place, either in Azure or in M365, that we can now use to put in place to govern the access to the data that we're dealing with. And remember, this is all in relationship with Copilot for Microsoft 365. And in other videos, we described Copilot as a tool honors the data protection models and all the stuff that we're talking about here as part of that zero trust. They honor the settings that have been configured outside of nothing specifically in Copilot. It says if it's got security or if it's got data protection on it, I will honor those. And if a person can't access it, I won't give them that information as part of my response to their prompts that they're working with. So this is an important part of that Copilot journey that you're looking for, is protecting the data and making sure that just the users that need the access to the information and the type of access because one of the things you want to be concerned about is, remember that depending on how you configured Copilot for Microsoft 365, either using connectors or plugins, you can either have a read-only version of that information, or you potentially might have read-write capabilities to the information that Copilot will be presenting to you. And so if people don't need write access, you want to be able to set that up to make sure it's only read availability. Moving on to the next topic, we're going to take a look at app protection. No longer is it just about user identities, and you saw that in the identity management. Applications and things called managed identities are a new feature that we have available to us, that the applications themselves can have an identity. And so we want to take a look at a wide range of protection that you want to have within the application, because somebody may be using an application that the application is accessing Copilot for Microsoft 365. And how does that work when I have a user that might not have access to the information, but the application they're using does? That could potentially be the breach point or the compromise that you're working with. So being able to take a look at application protection in relationship to the Copilot for Microsoft 365 experience is something you want to consider. You'll see some terms at the bottom, the MDM or mobile device management and mobile application management, and how we manage those devices as a way to access this information. And so what we could potentially do is be able to manage the applications on your phone and say, listen, you maybe have installed Word on your phone, and that's great, but that's your copy of Word because maybe it's a BYOD or bring your own device, and it's not a corporately managed device. So I don't get to put policies around secure encrypted information that might be accessed using the Word application. And so we can, with mobile device and mobile application management, say, hey, listen, you have access to this data, but we're going to open it up in a secure version of Word that is deployed by the corporation, that we can manage that application, make sure it's patched and it has all the requirements, versus your own version. So all of these are important pieces to manage the application uses and deployment and how they access the data itself. So we'll go into a demonstration and show you some of the app protection features.
When it comes to the application and the device management, also known as MDM or mobile device management and MAM, mobile application management, we get to it by launching Endpoint Manager from the Microsoft 365 admin portal. Now we're in the admin portal for application and device management. This is where we can get into our devices and create a set of policies on how we want the devices to be managed, as well as the applications on them. This can be managed through a BYOD, bring your own device, or corporately owned devices. You can create policies for wiping applications and data off the devices. And if it's a corporately owned device, you can actually wipe the entire device if it is reported lost. We also can now control the applications themselves and their behavior through a set of policies. It's in here where you're going to be able to require specific applications to be used to open up certain type of documents or certain types of data. You can also prevent certain types of data from being cut and copied from one application to another on the device, or being used as a forward within the email. So all of these policies allow you to control the application, use of data, as well as the devices that it's used on. Let's return back to the lesson.
Welcome back. Hopefully that was interesting for you as well as informative, but application is just one layer. Let's move into the next. We're now going to be taking a look at deploying or validating the device management. So this is going to get back into that MAM, mobile application, and MDM, mobile device management. Microsoft has features for this. You'll see Microsoft Intune has been around for a while, but there's other tools that provide that management capability. And again, that management structure that you provide is going to be honored by your use of Copilot for Microsoft 365. And so why you want to have that layered approach, remember it's a defense in depth and a zero trust is what we're talking about here, is making sure that we've got all these different layers and the potential for them to be able to access information through your use of Copilot for Microsoft 365. As you start to implement and integrate this into your business practices, it's going to be very important that you've put those considerations in up front. And hopefully, if you're maybe holding off deploying Copilot for Microsoft 365 because you're unsure of it, this is going to give you that comfort and capability to be able to go off and enable those features so that your users can benefit from all of the value that Copilot is going to provide for them. So yeah, the mobile device management, this is the ability to sit there and say, yeah, we're going to give you access to that secure information, but I want to be able to control it. I gave you some examples around the conditional access. This is not MDM or MAM specifically, but if you're in a secure location on our corporate network, yes, you can access that information. But if you're in a public Wi-Fi at a coffee shop, you're not going to be able to access it. Well, that's one level. That's conditional access. But the mobile device management features will going to sit there and say, hey, I don't want you to take a screenshot of that information. I don't want you to cut and paste it from the device or the application that I've got presented the information to into maybe an unsecured environment. So this is that layered approach that we're dealing with. So let's take a look at the next step that you want to take a look at is that threat protection services. We've got a wide variety of capabilities that will provide these services for you. And it is, you often hear the terms called SEAM and SOAR, is how do we have this layered approach and using a whole variety, and you'll see those blue boxes in the center there that are going to provide a set of tools that we can deploy that is going to provide that threat protection. It's like antivirus software, probably the easiest one to take a look at, but we've got a whole set of Defender features, the branded services that we have. We've got Defender for Cloud, and we've got Defender for Devices and Defender for Windows. And so you want to make sure that you are setting up a monitoring process that is going to be able to identify known threats and be able to alert you or potentially intervene in that threat, potentially compromising your use of not just the data, but Copilot itself. So make sure that you've got a well-designed threat protection system at a layered approach at the different levels that are indicated on the slide. We then take a look at secure collaborations across a whole set of the different services that are available in Microsoft 365. You've got Excel, you've got Word, you've got Teams, we've got OneDrive. And we talked about in another module setting up these barriers of communication and saying maybe this department can't share information with another department. And unfortunately, currently at this time, those barriers are two ways. So it's not like you can set up, I can talk to you, but you can't talk to me. That's not how it sets up. It says, in this Teams channel maybe that you have, that is set up for maybe the HR department. If they're in that department, they can't be bringing, either unknown users or even people in your organization that, will not be able to gain access to some of the things that are being discussed in there. So there's this whole level of controls that we can put around securing the environments that are going to be used by Copilot for Microsoft 365, and they will provide the security and protection that you're dealing with. So, people include organizations, they see, and making sure that we have just enough access by just those people that need to have it. So a layered approach that we're dealing with. And we're at the last point here is you want to go through and either deploy or validate that minimum per user permissions that you're dealing with. And you'll see that we use the term RBAC or role-based access control, is how do I gain access to that information either at the file level or at a higher structural level in a hierarchy that you have. Dealing with something like SharePoint, you get sites, and then within the sites you've got the libraries you're dealing with. So how do I build that hierarchical structure and have that defense in depth? Because I don't want them to potentially be able to gain access to the entire site, so I don't have to do it on a per document basis, because maybe there might be a chance that the inheritance didn't work properly. So shutting things down at the right organizational or structural level that you have of the data path that you're dealing with is going to be an important part of that protection. By default, you'll notice that a lot of these permissions that you'll see inherit parents' capabilities. So as a child object to a parent, if I'm a file in a folder, I'm going to inherit a lot of my default permissions from my parent, which is the folder settings that you're dealing with. But you can override those by coming down to the objects themselves. And so we're think about that hierarchical structure and maybe set some very restrictive components at the beginning. Remember, we want to only open things up and not lock things down. Another challenge that we often see in this configuration is people will say, oh, I want to block something. And remember that blocks typically override and allow. So if you've allowed a person to have some access because you thought you were just going to open it up for them, and you say, oh, but I want to make sure no one else has access to this, and you block everybody. Well, that person you gave access to is part of the everybody group that you define, and so the block will actually override the allow. So these become some of the challenges that I've experienced of our customers, making sure that they get the right permission set. And not do you just want to deploy these, as the word says there, validate them to make sure that the necessary permissions are being gained access to for what you need to do. And you want to just, hey, yeah, can they read the document? Yeah, they can read the document. Well, that's great. You've validated that. But you want to make sure that all those other permissions that you didn't want are also validated, that they don't have that. So make sure you try the delete, you try the right operation. And if they can, then you've got to lock that down, or maybe you've over-provisioned that. We've explored the Microsoft recommendations of deploying a zero trust model in preparation for deploying Copilot for Microsoft 365. And we've looked at all the different areas from identity management, device management, data management that you can have in that zero trust model. Now, with regards to all of the areas that I covered in here, know that each area is going to also be covered in depth in a separate recording. So if you're interested in any one or all of them, I look forward to potentially seeing you in one of those other recordings. Thanks very much for joining me. I look forward to seeing another recording. Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Tickleman, and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. I'm here today to inform you on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today I'll be focusing on Copilot for Microsoft 365 data governance. The product and features that will be discussed are current as of the time of this recording. And because of the rapid rate of change in technologies, I encourage you to reference the product documentation to get the most current information on the features and functions that are available. Let's get into this. We've talked about in other recordings about a zero trust model, a governance model. We're going to take a look at the implementation around a governance control that you want to have around identities. And so this is a broad topic. We're going to pick up a few of the features that we have focused on that we feel are important for you to deploy or evaluate if you've already deployed some features of these in your organization regarding its impact on Copilot for Microsoft 365. So we'll take a look at what those governance controls are, and specifically look at entitlement management. We'll look at privileged identity management, or PIM. We'll look at conditional access and that just-in-time component. Now, you might also hear a term JE, or just enough access. That's also going to be done partly through some of the other pillars, so they'll be covered in those specifically. When you take a look at identity governance, we are looking at a way to automate, and that's typically what we try and do from a governance perspective. So whenever I use that term, I always try and frame it in the concept of a governance model allows you to have a set of predicted outcomes based around interactions. And those interactions could be person to person, person to system, system to system, or system to person. So those four types are the major interactions that you have. And I can say if this person talks to that person, this should be the outcome of that activity. And if you can define what that is, it becomes a governance model that you could then set the guardrails up to make sure that those interactions yield the type of outcomes that you would have expected. And if not, then what do I do? If something breaches that expected outcome, do I stop it? Do I just alert somebody that that has taken place? So this identity governance is a huge piece of this. And where you're going to take a look at this feature specifically, and I said this is a whole topic with a whole bunch of other areas broadly used, but identity governance specifically in relationship to Copilot for M365 is about attack threats and vectors. When you take a look at high-level user account access, they are basically going to have access to almost everything in your organization. You take a look at within Azure specifically, there's a thing called a global administrator. It has access to everything in Azure itself. And if that account gets compromised, it's going to be a huge impact to Copilot for M365 because all the data that it's going to use in its responses is going to be everything that you have available to it because that account has that access. So we've got controls and recommendations around the global administrator group specifically. I'm not going to get into that here, but what we want to take a look at is, across an organization, there's a whole level of administrators, whether they be account operators that need to, create users and provision those users. We've got SharePoint operators, we've got Exchange administrators. We want to make sure that you've got just enough access that an Exchange administrator is not also a SharePoint administrator. And if they are, they should be separate permissions. And there are roles that they are going to perform. And what you want to be able to do is have that role in just in time, just enough. You want to be able to have just that permission at the time it needs to be performed. I often tell the story that I'll fun when I'm on vacation and I meet people on vacation and they'll tell me something about them and they're usually an administrator. I'm going, wow, that's really interesting. Are you an administrator right now? Are you managing that Exchange server? I'm going, nope. I'm going, why do you have that permission? Because that account is now having that capability. If it gets compromised while you're not even there, it is an attack surface that you have that you never accounted for. So you want to make sure that you're building an identity governance model that says, I want to be able to elevate and automate, that's the governance part, and say, hey, a person, yes, they can do this role, but they have to request access or grant that access maybe through conditional access that they're working away and says, ooh, I need to do that thing on that Exchange server. I'm going to request the access. I can manually do it and have the automated processes that it would allow it to take place. And it would give it to me for an hour, say. And you would perform that activity and then it would deprecate that capability. So we'll go in and take a look at what identity governance does. And not just across the broad range of user accounts, but we really want to take a particular attention on focusing on those administrative roles because they are one of the biggest attack surfaces that are a threat to your organization and the use of things like Copilot for Microsoft 365 because of the blast radius of the account that has across potentially access to all the data. We want to move into another area that we can get into in account management, and this is going to get into entitlement management. And entitlement is the way to be able to group things together to give access automatically to resources or to users so that they only get what they need when they need that component. So we've made reference to this before. So entitlement management is the ability for you to be able to take a look at properties of users, because remember, not just users, you want groups. You've got now managed identities, you've got applications. So there's this broad spectrum of identities that we can have that we want to manage the life cycle from creation through use through the destruction of those accounts and make sure that they have the necessary access that they need, and they may need to be checked on a regular basis and elevated up or brought back down. Maybe they've changed roles in your organization. So all of these pieces provide for management of it. I don't think I mentioned it in this recording, but make sure that if you haven't got these, you want to make sure you put them in place, or you now want to go back and reevaluate them in conjunction with the specific lens around not just regular access and use. You want to now start taking a look at it. What is the impact of having Copilot for Microsoft 365? Being able as an application to have these accesses that you're working with. So you want to put on a different pair of lenses to say, oh yeah, we've got that covered. We've done that for years. Yeah, but you're adding a new mix into this. And so anytime you add a new use of access to data resources, you want to make sure that you're reevaluating the management pieces that you have in place. Let's move on to the next feature of identity management we're going to take a look at. And this is going to get into that term PIM, or Privileged Identity Management. Hopefully this is one that you're very familiar with, because it's a term that's been around for a while. And it's a feature of identity management within inside of Azure that provides a broad range of capabilities. And what you could potentially do, for example, you have a group membership. So I'm a member of a group for whatever reason. Maybe I'm an HR user, so I'm a member of the HR group. Well, that's pretty static. But what you might have is groups that are project-based, and the dynamic relationship might be, fairly fluid. And so what you can have is a whole set of controls for this privileged identity management to say, hey, you've been elevated to this project level. We're going to say every 6 months that either you as a member of that group, I'm going to require you to validate, hey, are you still on that team? And maybe that's a simple process. Yes, I'm still on that team, so you can self-attestate that I'm a part of that team. Maybe it's got to go to the project owner that says, hey, are these people still a member of that team? So this is just one example of privileged identity management that we can now use to make sure that we are having the right people getting the right amount of access that they're working with. And then you can also then have, to be able to exercise a capability that role gives you, or that membership gives you. You might have to also now require maybe multi-factor authentication, because yes, I logged in, but I'm using my regular access to my email, but I'm now going to try and access that sensitive data. It's going to elevate me back up and potentially ask that I now use something like a multi-factor authentication. We're getting near the end of these, but you want to take now that conditional access that I've mentioned throughout this lesson. But conditional access is this way to take the deployment engine for this zero trust model we've talked about, taking those things, signals, and we'll take a look at a broad range of signals that are available. So you can be listening for all these different things. What kind of login is the person doing? Are they on a device? Are they in a location? Hey, you logged in a few minutes ago in another geographic location. You're logging in now, across the country. Like, that seems improbable. So all of these things, you might be able to justify it, maybe add a VPN connection to that other location that allowed it to take place. But you just want to be able to think of all of these different conditions that might create a signal that says, the one I often use is, Bob, that's a user account, that's great, that's a signal, he's authenticated. Is he on a secure device, yes or no? Is he on his phone? Yes or no? Is he on a corporately owned laptop? Yes or no? Is he on a BYOD laptop? Yes or no? Those are different conditions, or what we often refer to as personas. So I'm the persona of this user account in this device, in this location. So Bob on a secure laptop, on a secure network, accessing secure data is a completely different persona that I have to build a conditional access to, versus Bob on his phone accessing, the company cafeteria menu is, completely different. And so I might want to have different conditional access to say, will I even allow it to take place? Or maybe you're on a corporate device securely and you've logged in and, you've got some authentication that's taken place. But now you're trying to access the high-end research that you've been working on, and now I need you to have multi-factor authentication. So all of those signals, you then have to have business practices, governance, that we've talked about to make a decision. Do I either require something else to be done? Do I allow it to take place? Do I deny it from taking place? So those become those activities that they can have, and that's the enforcement piece that says, for you to do this, you have to meet these requirements. And if you can't, I'm going to stop that from happening. Again, this is going to be a huge capability for you to be able to control access to the data that Copilot for M365 will have, that the person may have access to it. So from a permission perspective, absolutely, they have permissions, and we talked about access control differently, but not on that device. And so now, using Copilot, they may now get asked for multi-factor authentication, or maybe it just doesn't give them that access. So this is an important part of that layered approach. So when you take a look at that common signals, here's just a kind of a listing of some of the things that I've talked about. Identities, locations, devices that you're on. You're seeing that on the left-hand side. The kind of things that you're trying to access on the right-hand side. So it's this combination of, and the term I used, personas, and you want to think of that end-to-end. So what is it? Is it a user or is it a device? Is it a user on a device? Is user on a device on a network So think of these different use case personas that you can have, and you can actually predict what the outcome should be, and you can now enforce those with a conditional access. So let's go take a look at that in a demonstration.
What I want to demonstrate is a very simple use of conditional access. And while I'm going to restrict access to one application, this is a very capable tool that if you can think of personas, and what I refer to as the persona is not just a user account with a password, it's all the conditions that that user may use that username and password. The example I used in the lecture is, the persona of myself on a secure device using a secure piece piece of software on a secure network accessing secure data is a completely different persona than myself on my cell phone using an app on my phone on a public Wi-Fi to access that same information. So those are kind of two ends of the extreme, and everything in between. And I can either allow or deny, require multi-factor authentication. So all these complex situations are capable to be configured based around your creativity around conditional access and how you want to guard data. And again, you want to do this in context to Copilot for Microsoft 365 of which data is going to be consumed by the large language model to include with not its pre-trained information, but your corporate data specifically. So this example, I am going to first log in with Sway, an application, a web-based application online. I'm going to use this in private browser session, and I'm going to gain access to it. I'm then going to go up instead of a very simple conditional access to block that access for this user. And with no additional changes, I'm now going to be able to block that access. Let's go into the demo. So logging into sway.office.com, going to prompt me for my username and password, which I'm going to need. And I have access to the application. I'm going to be coming back to this in browser session in a bit, so I'm going to close this one down. I'm now in the identity portal, and several ways to get into here, whether it's from your own admin console page or by getting to it directly. Once I'm on the identity governance page, I'll come into the protection feature and come to conditional access. There are full recordings on all of the capabilities of conditional access, so I'm not going to go through them all, but what I am going to do is create a new policy. I'm going to give it a name. I then get a number of options that I can configure for this conditional access. Users, target resources, conditions, what is the access control that I want to configure, and down here at the bottom, is it report only or turn on? These are just some of the features I'm going to have to go through. So I'm going to first of all assign it to a selected user or group. Look for the admin account. I'm going to assign it to myself. You can see that it's now specified to specific user. What is the target resource? I'll select Sway. Well, I'm not going to configure the conditions. We talked about user risk, sign-in risk. These are all different conditions that you can allocate for in my example of, are you in a public Wi-Fi? So you can control this. What I want to do is change the access control. I can either block it, which I'm going to do, or you can set up the specific configurations. And remember, you can have multiple conditional accesses that would apply even to a single user logon, and knowing that the most controlled is the one that is going to rule out or require its conditions to be met. I'm going to turn this feature on and then create. So I now have a conditional access that will block my use of Sway. Let me go back to that in private browsing session. So I'm back in my in private browsing session. I'm going to start Sway, go through that logon process again. And now you can see that I've been blocked. Just as a simple demonstration of conditional access, it's up to your imagination to think around the personas that you would want to be able to control access to things like Copilot for Microsoft 365. Maybe while you're in the office using corporate devices, you might be able to access a broader range of data to be included in the Copilot responses, where if you're in a public environment or on an unsecured device, you may not want certain types of access to resources. And again, this goes back to other portions we've covered in this series where we talked about being able to label data and be able to create policies and restrictions to that information. Let's go back to the lecture.
Welcome back. We've got one more to take a look at from an identity management perspective, and we're going to take a look at this just in time. You've heard me use a term before, JEA, or just enough access, which says at the moment that you need to do something, and especially if it's a higher level administrator capability, I want you to have just enough administration. So I'm a user, I'm getting my email, I'm on Teams, doing all that regular stuff like every other user in my company, but all of a sudden now I get a request from somebody to do something that I need an elevated permission. I shouldn't have to be able to do that right now. I have to elevate myself up to that role, perform the activity, and then be able to come back out of it and then be elevated back down. We talked about that previously in a way to automate that process. And now that just-in-time capabilities that says, I just don't want to have to elevate and then have it be there. I'm going to need it only when I need it, and then it's going to manage that process to say you have it for an hour, and then we're going to possibly take that away. So whether it be a manual process that maybe I need a second person, we often take a look at, how do you circumvent bad behavior in an organization, whether it be accidental or even intentional. One that we often use as an example that might ring true for you is the backup operator in your organization has the ability to read every file in the system, because that's what backups can do. They need read access to all data everywhere, even though that the person performing the backup may not have that access. Now, you think about that, that's great. So I need that, it's a good feature, and I'm happy with that, because the backup capability says that user with this backup software from this has that capability to read it. Well, now flip that around. If I want to become a bad actor, what stops me from saying, I was able to back up, that research material that we had. I've got it on a backup. I can't read it. Maybe it's encrypted, or maybe I don't have permissions to do that. I can't read it, but I can restore it. And as a backup operator, the default capability is to back up, but I can also restore. And if I restore it back to its original location, it's secure. I can't gain access to it. But what stops me from restoring that back to a location other than its original location? Maybe like my laptop. Well, I still can't read it. I don't have permissions to it. But as the owner of that laptop, this is where you maybe heard me say in other recordings, the difference between rights and permissions. And so I don't have permissions to read that object, but as the owner of this laptop, I have the right, which supersede permissions, to change the permissions on it. And so now I could actually see that information. So what we want to do is have this separation of control that says you are, as a backup operator, you can back up at this time, and that just enough access says you can't restore though. You need two people in collusion now to be able to breach the security that we're dealing with. And so that's part of that just in time. Yeah, maybe I want you can elevate yourself up, but I'm gonna have to have someone else authenticate or authorize that for you. So you can provide those capabilities. And even if you didn't, I would strongly suggest that as people elevate in a just-in-time model, you may want to audit that information. And we'll come up in another recording later on, because while I think that you're great and you're doing it and you need to be able to do that on your own, I still want to be able to have, especially as you elevate to a very high level administrator, I want to be able to audit that and have a record that took place in case I ever have to go back and do any forensic looks at what happened and why it happened and what could have possibly caused that. So being able to have a record of that is, I think, an important part that really isn't covered in any of the material, but I just want to point it out. So we've seen a whole range and just a subset of all the administrative governance components that you might want to have as part of a zero trust model. This is a topic that people specialize in. I was trying to pick up some topics that specifically, as maybe an administrator of your M365 environment, what the implications of now enabling Copilot for Microsoft 365, what are the things that are going to make you comfortable to be able to light those features up and make them available to your users? And if making sure that whether you have to implement them or just do a check with the people that are responsible in your organizations to get this stuff done, it's going to be a way for you to be very comfortable that you feel that the data is protected, the access control is there, and it's going to be a safe environment for your users and your data to exist and become more productive in your environment. Thanks for spending some time with me. I look forward to seeing you at a potential another recording. Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Tickleman, and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. I'm here today to inform you on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today I'll be focusing on Copilot for Microsoft 365 data governance. The product and features that will be discussed are current as of the time of this recording, and because of the rapid rate of change in technologies, I encourage you to reference the product documentation to get the most current information on the features and functions that are available. Let's get into this. In a previous recording, we talked about what zero trust was. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the pillars of what Zero Trust are and how you can implement them in regards to Copilot for Microsoft 365. So we'll take a look at the areas or the pillars that we're going to take a look at. We'll take a look at the deployment plans that we have. As I mentioned, it is a well-documented and architected solution. So we'll go through, show you the areas and actually do some demonstrations. As I mentioned, Zero Trust isn't a tool, it isn't a product, it isn't a button that you can turn on. It is a set of features that you can measure against. And it is a good idea not just to deploy a Zero Trust model, but you want to validate that that Zero Trust model is working. And so on a regular basis, you should do these audits to make sure that the Zero Trust benchmark that you've allocated is being met and measured against as you go through this. And so what you're seeing on the screen is an example of Zero Trust deployed through Microsoft 365's admin console that you can actually measure your deployment of M365 against a Zero Trust model recommendation that we're dealing with. Now this is going to use our baselines so you can see where you want to go either above or below those measurements themselves. But remember, the big thing here is it is more of a philosophy or a concept or a strategy that you want to deploy that you then measure against. And we're going to be constantly looking at the different tools that provide this. When you look at the technology pillars that the Zero Trust is applied against, you're seeing across the spectrum, from identities, which we've covered in another module. We take a look at hardware and devices and applications and data, and all of these different components are part of the defense in depth model that we look at. And so at each layer, you want to have a plan to be able to, from a Copilot from M365 component exercise, that you've put those measurements in place. Because remember, because Copilot by default will allow or honor the security controls that you have around the data that it's going to use in its responses that it's going to generate for you. When you take a look at this diagram, it's quite busy. I'm not going to go into it, but I just want to show that this is well documented. We've got all the areas. You can go off and find this if you were to take a look at the deployment of M365 with Zero Trust. You'll actually get this diagram. I want to point out that the image on the far left-hand side of that, I'm actually going to bring that image up in a few minutes and then break it down into some individual components that we'll take a look at. We then also take a look at the architecture. And at the center of that diagram, there's a set of policies that you want to take a look at. And really kind of around the periphery are those pillars that we've talked about. So on the far left-hand side, you're seeing the identities that you're dealing with, the users and the devices that you might have. The policies become really how you are going to respond from a Zero Trust perspective. What do I have to give access to? Who has access to it? And we're going to show you in another module that using privileged identity management and looking at access controls, there's a whole set of policies that you need to define that you then deploy to the scopes, those different areas or pillars that we're looking at. So if you want to come back and look at this at some other point, or a reference in other modules as we drill down and look at the specific technology that's going to be used, this is just a great point of reference to understand the landscape in which your Zero Trust is going to be deployed across. As I mentioned just a minute ago, on the far left-hand side, this is going to show three major areas of the deployment of a Zero Trust model as kind of a rolling out. And there's some colors that are used. I'm going to zoom in here in just a few minutes so that you can actually see some of the areas. And again, I'm not going to go too deep into the topics themselves. This is more of an overview. We will cover each one of the things that I highlight here in other recordings. But let's just jump into the first one, that top piece that you're dealing with. You can see that the color codings that they have, in this case, it's coming across yellow, so it's that far right-hand side item across the key on the bottom. So it's not really the devices and things that are there. And what they're going to focus on in here is to protect and give access to the data. And this is going to be one of the biggest pillars that we take a look at as we take a look at Copilot for Microsoft 365. Securing the data to make sure that it does not inadvertently overshare information through prompt responses that it's going to give to users. So we're going to come in and I'm going to do a demonstration of a number of these features and how they can provide a part of that Zero Trust. So let's go into a demonstration and take a look at it.
When looking at the governance components of the Zero Trust model at this level, almost everything was covered through information protection and governance. So launching from the Microsoft 365 admin portal, select compliance. Once you're in the compliance manager, the majority of the configurations happen around data loss prevention. And it's in here that you're going to configure a set of policies that you want to deploy across your data estate. You can create your policies, and you notice in here that we can build from a template or have a custom deployment that you're working with. Notice that the vast majority of these templates that have been created, whether it be enhanced, financial, medical, and health, all come from the data classifiers when we take a look at data classification and the policies you can create in here, either as a trainable classification or sensitive information type. The remaining pieces at this level are components that come from security. Selecting security, you move to the security homepage and you can connect all of your software as a service applications for protection. So those are the configuration components that you can deploy to build a Zero Trust model. Let's return to the lecture.
So welcome back. Not a deep demonstration. This was not really necessarily a demonstration on how to deploy to M365 a Zero Trust model, just showing you some of the concepts and the things that you can do. And if you want more information on any one of the specific areas, by all means, look up a video, and we've got lots of information on how to actually implement the Zero Trust model in that specific technology or pillar area you're dealing with. Moving on to the next area, that's that center piece, it's going to defend against threats. We talked about one of the major pillars of being able to identify, and it's that sentinel component, being able to monitor, look around, see what threats are out there, and being able to identify a potential threat and then have a response action that deals with that. So we've got a whole series of components, and you see now more of the screen appears a little green, and so we're now falling into a different area of the pillar that we're going to deploy this against. So let's go do a demonstration and take a look at defending against threats.
At this level of the Zero Trust model, all of the activities fall into either devices or security operations. To manage devices, from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, select Endpoint Manager. Once you're in the Endpoint Manager, you'll get all the configuration features around the specific devices that you want to manage. You can onboard either a BYOD or bring your own device, or manage devices, whether they be Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, or Linux. We can also manage all of the configuration and compliance conditions around these devices you want to manage. There's a full set of administration for managing the applications, as well as the security posture and patch management of these devices. The other area that you want to get into from a security area is the Windows Defender products. That will be done through the security portal. And in here, you're going to be able to manage all of the Windows Defender components, whether it be Defender for Cloud, Defender for Identity, Defender for Office 365, Defender for Endpoint, and Defender for Cloud Apps. All of those specific areas can be used to protect the data. Let's return back to the lecture.
Welcome back. So you've now seen some of the things that you can implement from a Microsoft perspective to identify a potential threat. So if someone is performing potential malicious behaviors, through your use of Copilot for Microsoft 365, is there some way that you can identify that if you want to know? Because even if you've protected against it, it's nice to know that someone is trying to breach those services. It's just thinking, I've got my life protected because, I've got all these threat protections in there and they're going to stop it and I've got a thing blocked off. That's great. But if you don't know that someone's even trying to do these attacks, there's other methods that you want to be careful about. So, make sure that you're monitoring for these on an ongoing basis. So let's take a look at the final area of the deployment model. So this is from that bigger picture. That's the very bottom portion of it. And you can see more blues and greens. So those areas that we've taken a look at, or pillars, are starting to become shifted to the left side of that chart. And so in here, we're going to take a look at the foundations, the Zero Trust components that we're building with. And we'll go in and take a look at some of those areas right now in a demo.
The foundation of the Zero Trust model starts with identity and device management. So starting off with devices, this was covered in the previous demo where we looked at all of the device management components that you have available to protect the devices and their access and use of data on them. The other area of the Zero Trust model covers identities. And from the Microsoft 365 admin portal, selecting identity will bring you to the admin portal. It's in here that we're going to be able to manage our users, groups, devices, and applications. applications. When we get into protection, there's identity protection, conditional access, authentication methods, password resets, and custom security attributes. Each of these are configured down below under the protection section. Looking at our identity protection, the things that we can do to classify identities, whether they be risky users, risky workload identities, conditional access. In the conditional access is where we're able to manage the different personas where a user acting on a secure device in a secure network might be considered differently than a user on a BYOD device in a public Wi-Fi area. Under identity governance, we get a full set of management around entitlement management, privileged identity management, and lifecycle workflows, which gets into the permissions that users have to be able to access certain features, as well as the data itself. Let's return back to the lesson.
Okay, welcome back. So that completes our journey, taking a look at the deployment of a zero trust model inside of Microsoft 365, and with a specific focus around what its implementations are in regards to the use of Copilot for Microsoft 365. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and I look forward to potentially seeing you at another recording.